Welcome to the other side of midnight. I'm your host tonight, Keith Morgan. I usually do the audio engineering, but tonight Richie's is having electrical problems, so I am sitting in for Richard, and I am picking up this from here out, and we seem to have lost our friend Ron Gerbron. Let me see if I can get him back. Let's see. So, welcome to the other side of midnight. We're going to be talking about a great subject tonight. We're going to be talking about anti-gravity. That's one of my favorite subjects because now with the military coming out with UAPs, the new version of UFOs, just their version so they can disassociate it with it. The anti-gravity has a lot of stuff that will give us the ability to do things that we didn't think was possible, because anti-gravity is one of those, that's impossible. This doesn't fit the physics. The science doesn't match, but it does. And we are just now starting to discover that, even though my opinion is these guys have had anti-gravity since the 1950s after the Roswell crash. And they've been playing with it because Ben Rich said, we have the ability to travel amongst the stars. We could take E.T. home tomorrow. He said, if you've seen it on Star Trek or Star Wars, we've been there, done that, but we found it wasn't practical. And he said that we've got stuff that would make George Lucas drool. And then he said, well, these things are all locked up in black projects so tightly that it would take an act of God to get them released. So here we go with someone telling us who worked for Lockheed Skunk Works, the guys who gave us the U-2, the guys who gave us the SR-71 Blackbird, the guys who gave us the F-117 stealth fighter, the B-1 stealth bomber, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's telling us we have technologies that are well beyond man's capabilities. So now we're still groping for stuff, and we're finally putting all the pieces together, and we still are flying into space on flames. We've been burning stuff since caveman days. It's time to get off of that mess. It's time to move forward and move into the 21st century with our eyes wide open. So our guest tonight is going to be Mark, let me see if I pronounce your name right, Sokol. And he's been working on anti-gravity. So I'm not going to keep him off any longer because I want to hear what he has to say. But we had a nice conversation before the show, but we're going to be talking about anti-gravity. So here's Mark. Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's just past midnight here on the East Coast, and we're getting hammered by Hurricane Henry's outer bands. And I'm here in the lab in Hawthorne, New Jersey, and we're ready to talk about anti-gravity. Like, where do you want me to start?
Well, give me a history of
the beginning.
Yeah, tell me who Mark is. Tell me how Mark got into this whole thing and what excited him to say, let me look at something that most people think is impossible.
Okay, so that really started with my childhood. I grew up in a very religious family, religion being Judaism, in Lakewood, New Jersey. My Hebrew name is Yisrael Meier, which means to enlighten the Jews, and Meier in English is Mark. That's where the Mark Sokol comes from. And I went to a very religious school, the Lakewood Cheder, which translated the Torah into Yiddish. It was a very ultra-Orthodox upbringing. Then at the age 13, my dad was in Israel for a short while learning there, and he came back. On the way back, his flight turned around and flew back to Israel. It said, the the airspace of America was closed. It was September 11th, if you remember that date, 2001. I was 13 at the time, and 2 weeks later, a family of 11 picked up and moved to Israel. My dad took that as a sign that we have to move. We moved to the old city of Jerusalem, where I lived for 7 years and continued my studies of the Torah, the Hebrew Bible in its original Hebrew form. And so I really saw Judaism from both angles, both from the ultra-Orthodox center of Judaism in America, which is Lakewood, New Jersey, and from the center of Judaism worldwide, which is the old city of Jerusalem. And it was only after contemplating everything and like really going deep in on the Torah that I came to the realization that the only thing that could explain the Torah was aliens. Like the ancient astronaut theory that aliens came down with their advanced technology and were manipulating man, splitting of the sea, had to have been some anti-gravity technology. By that time, I was already married with a kid, and I started having these conversations in the synagogue with people. Some of them were interested. Some of them thought I was crazy. And some of them challenged me back saying, if the technology exists, figure it out. Let me see the technology. And I took that challenge to heart and started investigating it, trying to figure out what was going on. In the end of 2016, or it was like early 2017, I was at a program called Landmark Education. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they basically go into like how the mind works and challenge people to make themselves better. And at the end of the program, the advanced course, they asked everyone to get up on stage and make a declaration of something they're going to do. And I got up there and said, I'm going to figure out how warp drives work. And the instructor, like even she couldn't contain herself and started laughing. But sure enough, I started this WhatsApp group right then and there, and there was some people that came over to me that were kind of interested. One guy worked for NASA at some point, and I put them all in this WhatsApp group and just started discussing the topic, looking at different effects, different claims that were made, yada, yada. And eventually, more and more people got involved, and I started reaching out to people on YouTube. Like there's a famous YouTube channel called Alien Scientist. Jeremy Reese runs that channel. I eventually met up with him. I started running experiments first out of my garage, and then we moved that eventually to the shop. And I really just opened up the book, for starting with the low-lying fruit of these experiments to figure out, there's a claim that's been made by T. Townsend Brown, the gravitator experiment, we call it, where you have parallel plate capacitors, you're charging it up, and there's supposed to be this anti-gravity effect. Let's try that. There's the Boyd-Bushman effect.
Yeah, that was the electrogravitic lifters that people are playing with, like model rocketry today. So, yeah, I'm sorry. The electrogravitic thing is really, it should have been something that people should have been paying attention to. The Mythbusters did a thing about it. They built a lifter, and Grant Imahara couldn't get it to work, so he called the guy that he bought the kit from. He talked him through, and when it lifted up, he was falling off his chair. They said, "Oh, it's putting out a 1 mile an hour ion wind, and that must be what's lifting it." So they built a vacuum chamber out of clear plexi, and they put it in there, and they turned it on and said, "See, it's not lifting in a vacuum because it's that 1 mile an hour ion wind." And you could see on the dowel rod in the front, they were burning the dowel rod because they got grease from their fingers on the dowel rod. So the high voltage was running down the dowel rod, burning the dowel rod, and it was glowing embers. And anyway, that technology does work. It works in a vacuum. And T. Townsend Brown proved that back then. So I'm sorry. Go ahead and.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about it working in a vacuum. We've never seen it work in a vacuum. One thing I could tell you about vacuums that I've learned only through experimentation is that as you get closer to a full vacuum, there's a point where the atmosphere inside the vacuum actually becomes more conductive. So until you pull that really strong vacuum, you're not actually looking at what the craft would operate like in space. Ion craft do work. They work off of the process called thermohydrodynamics, electrohydrodynamics, which is high voltage creates this ion wind effect where ions are basically atoms or molecules that have an extra electron or a removed electron, and they want to come back to equilibrium. So if they have the correct amount of electrons for their outer shells and whatnot, so they either, if you're charging them negatively, that means they're getting an extra electron because an electron is a negative charged particle, and they're looking for a positive source, and they would go to anything that has that positive source and pick up that deposit that electron on that source, and the movement created from the particle or the molecule going down creates thrust that lifts the craft up. The main principle behind electrohydrodynamics is that electrons, or the lack of electrons, meaning when you have a positive potential, that's a lack of electrons, gets emitted from sharp objects and gets attracted to round objects, which is why the lifters usually have a sharp edge and then a rounded edge. I came up with this new design for a lifter, which is basically a piece of aluminum foil that's been shaped in the shape of a bowl. Then you have a rod, usually like a straw, plastic straw, and then you put some sharp wires on the top. That's where you feed the high voltage electricity. But it works either way. You can have the high voltage on the rounded end on the bottom too. That will work just fine. The problem is of course, then if you had that voltage there, it would short out to the ground right below it. So it's a little engineering challenge. It's easier to have it on the top, but that's an easy way to do it. I actually had some kids come over to the lab a couple of times, and they make these little ion craft. Takes about 20 minutes to half an hour to make them, and then we bring them into the back of the lab, charge them up to around 50,000 volts, and they all start to fly. It's a pretty cute project, but it's not anti-gravity in any shape or form. It is just electro-hydrodynamics, like I explained before. The B-2 stealth bomber does use this principle to help out with the thrust. I think they're getting their high voltage potential off of the jet engine.
And the leading edge, yeah.
Yeah, that's where they put the high voltage. But the high voltage is coming from the jet engines. There's a way to turn high heat into high voltage. This is one of Tesla's patents, and then they're able to take that high voltage potential that they got for free, sucking off spare energy off of the jet engines, and place that potential on the leading edge. What that does, high voltage, it acts like two magnets that you're trying to press together. It repels every molecule of air apart from each other. It makes it all expand. So the air that the craft is flying through becomes less dense, and there's less of a bow shock for the airplane. Also, the massive potential that's building up there also has a bit of an ion thrust effect, but that is secondary. The real thing that they're looking for is to reduce the bow shock in the front of the B-2, which is kind of important. But so we started off with the ion wind stuff, of course, because that was simple. I also checked out the Boyd-Bushman effect, which Boyd-Bushman worked for Lockheed, and he made a couple of videos that are widely available on YouTube before he died. And he explained that they discovered this effect that if you put two magnets with opposing poles, like north to north or south to south, and you force them together and then drop them, they will fall slower than the speed of gravity. Okay, it's an amazing claim. Let's try it out. I bought all the components, got this whole test rig set up, was having some trouble with the scale measurements because the scale was kept on zeroing out and everything. And I was afraid to actually drop it because the magnets were kind of expensive and heavy. But then I did a little bit more research and found there was a couple of people who already replicated the experiment. It does work. But what do you go from there? Like, the point of anti-gravity, or by anti-gravity I mean like however these flying saucers operate, is to take off. We're not looking to fall a little bit slower. So looking forward from there, I couldn't like figure out what the next step would be. So that was kind of a dead end. The
Mark,
electrohydrodynamics experiment. Yeah, go ahead.
can I ask you how much slower do they fall? I mean, I've heard of those experiments, and I sympathize with you not wanting to bust the magnets, but I might have put some yoga mats on the floor or something. It's the shock that causes the effect, or is it the simple juxtaposition of the fields?
What I think is happening is the you're repolarizing space as it falls very rapidly, because the field lines that come out of the magnet when they're forced together like that extend outward pretty far, and they're pretty intense. There's high flux, meaning there's high change in the magnetic field lines as it moves through space. Essentially, what you're doing is creating a linear motor, which theoretically should work to produce some thrust if you can create a linear motor with a high enough output. By a linear motor, I mean motors normally spin electromagnetic fields in a circle, and then there's the central hub that follows those magnetic field lines. Or if you have outboard, it's the other way around. You have the magnetic field lines coming in from that center, and then the magnets on the outside are following it. But that's essentially what an electric motor is, or an AC motor. With a linear motor, you're taking that entire thing and straightening it out, and you have magnetic field lines that are just, looping down or in one direction through through your rig. That's what a railgun is, or an accelerator. A particle accelerator is essentially just a linear motor with a lot of power to it.
Hey, Mark, I have on my YouTube channel a link to a video, and I can't think of the guy's name, but this is old guy. He's been in classified stuff and so forth, and he's demonstrating what he calls a cell. It looks like a elongated longines that's been sliced in half. So the bottom half of it, he spins it in one direction, and it spins and spins and spins and slows down. He spins it counterclockwise, and it goes around like a turn and a half, shutters, and stops and starts to go back the opposite direction real slow. And he's explain that. And the guy's saying, is that because of the Earth's rotation? And he says they don't know, because it's violating that law that says, what was it, Newton's law? It says object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. But yet, here this...
Oh, yeah, I saw those toys are... Yeah, I've seen them on Edmund Scientific. That's basically that's an effect of the shape of the object. It kind of looks like a lopsided pill, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I've seen that. I know that works off of the geometry of the object. When you spin it in one direction, it sort of raises up a little bit, and then when it slows down because of resistance, it now wants to turn in the other direction in order to get into its lower spin environment, because it has 2 points. It has two fulcrum points, for the center. That's not anything mysterious at all.
Okay.
You could 3D print those too. It's all about the shape, and you got to have a really smooth surface for that to work.
Well, what I was pointing out is that he did the experiment that you just talked about of jamming the two magnets together, the high Gauss magnets, putting a bolt through them and bolting them together so they don't repel, so they're stuck. And he dropped them, and he had students standing down at the bottom, and he said, pick up the one that hits the ground first, and hand it to me after I've dropped them. And he said that every time it would be the one that didn't have the magnets in it, because he put them in some kind of container that they both look like big rocks or something, but he dropped them simultaneously, and the one with the opposing magnets was the last one to fall, which, like you said, it caused it to drop slowly. So he talks about exactly what you just said about opposing magnets. So I found that was very interesting that you had that kind of technology.
I mean, theoretically, it should work. It's because empty space is not truly empty. There's something that's called the permittivity and permeability of space-time, and it's a value that doesn't equal zero. And by permittivity and permeability, we're talking about the dielectric strength, or the amount of voltage that can be contained in empty space before it arcs over. So the resistance of space-time is not infinite. Also, the reluctance of space-time, meaning the magnetic permeability of space-time, is not zero as well. There's a certain amount of magnetic flux that can be induced in space-time. And this is what basically gives us the speed of light, is those two values. The speed of light isn't really about light. It's more about the speed of inductance inside space-time. And when you change the orientation, the spin orientation of these flux lines very rapidly as the magnets are falling through space, you're dragging space-time along with it, in a sense, slowing its fall. And it's expected to, even according to modern physics, they would expect something like that to happen, although it would be a very small effect. And getting back to the other gentleman's question, we're talking about 1 to maybe 2% difference. Not even. It's a pretty small but slightly noticeable effect if you dropped it from a high enough distance. I'm dealing with pretty powerful magnets, so I was afraid to go and sacrifice them like that. If I included a rope or something to catch it, that would probably interfere with the test measurements, because you're dealing with such a small number.
Mark, you weren't doing it in a vacuum. Did you try doing it in a liquid? You could slow the whole process down.
Yeah, but if you're doing it in a liquid, then you're dealing with the inductance of the liquid. I mean, if you took a changing magnetic field and put it next to a liquid, the liquid would start to spin, unless it was had almost no conductivity. Liquids are affected by magnetic fields, especially mercury. We did an experiment once where we had a vial of mercury here in the lab and spun a field around it using a little Dremel, and the mercury was spinning pretty fast.
Sure.
Those effects are real. They are expected. They're field effects. You're talking about interacting with the field around the craft. To create.
Okay, I'm still digesting the inductance of the void that you were talking about. You got to be careful that we need a nerd alert button. You have to define terms as you go along that people don't get lost.
Let's break it down.
Yeah, why don't you tell people? Yeah, do it.
Okay, so
I'm sorry.
When we're talking about electricity, there's two components. There's the voltage, which is basically your electron potential. Think of that as water pressure. Then when an electron passes through a conductor, it doesn't go through it straight. There's something called an electron drift velocity, which is basically the electron, when it's passing through the object, it can come in and it can move pretty freaking slowly, like through copper, even with a DC current at a pretty high amperage. The electron is moving about at walking speed. It's moving very slowly through a copper inductor. If you were to do it through a superconductor, it'd be moving at tens of thousands of miles per second. You'd be moving very quickly. If the electron is moving through empty space, it's moving at the speed of light. But or almost the speed of light. So there's the electron drift velocity, and there's also the electron is moving through the object in a spiraling fashion. That creates spin orientation, because it's all spinning in the same direction it's moving to the right. That spin orientation is what we know of as electromagnetism. Magnetism is spin orientation of electrons. Now, the magnetic field permeates outward in the shape of a donut. It goes like up and around. This is just for a standard magnetic field. You get more complex ones. And anything that's in that donut shape will try to orient itself with the spin orientation of the electron. That, in a nutshell, is what we're talking about. So the electron is a force that's bouncing in and out of the space-time around it. So the space-time, or the ether that's around that we're living in, is basically the carrier for the electromagnetic wave. So when you have two magnets in opposition to each other, north to north, the reason why they're opposing each other is because they both have spin orientations in the same direction, but because they're facing each other, the point at which that spin orientation is dictated is coming from the opposite direction. It's sort of like having two clocks. You put them in opposition, you'll see the second hands are spinning in the other direction, right? That's because the motor is on one side. You know? And when they're in opposition, they don't want to, those fields don't want to combine. They're fighting each other. That's why the magnets oppose each other. When they're both facing in the same direction, where it'll be south to north, then the magnetic fields, the spin orientations are in the same direction. They want to combine together in order to get to their lowest energy state, which is an important concept in physics. Everything wants to get to its lowest energy state.
Well, why would it want to do that?
That's just the law of nature. Everything wants to go to its lowest energy state.
You want to hear my uneducated version of why magnets do what they do, why the homopolar effect takes place that Faraday discovered? I think there is an internal current running in the magnets once the material aligns. It's not just the spin of the electrons. There is a current. When you put that disc conductor on that magnet, that disc magnet, and you spin it all as one unit, that current walks up into that disc through some kind of skin effect, and now you can tap directly into it from the center and the edge. That's your plus and minus. And now you're tapped directly into that high current that's flowing inside the magnet in this hyperdimensional realm. And that's what gives us the high current and the low voltages to give us the homopolar effect. And that's why Bruce De Palma's end machine was 500% efficient, because it was tapped directly into the magnets. He was just using a small amount of energy to move it into the conductor so he could pull it out and tap directly into that current. And we know that the current does the work. So that's my uneducated version of what's taking place. Okay, so we're coming up on the break, so that's why I kind of broke in. So I'm like maybe 30 seconds out from actually going to break. Is there anything that you want to talk about real quick, or set us up for before we come back from break?
We'll definitely ask the viewers, listeners, to check out the terms current and amperage and voltage, and you'll see something called the babble in science, where what means one thing to one person can mean something to somebody else, something different to somebody else. So we'll get into that after the break.
Okay. And you're listening to The Other Side of Midnight, and I'm hosting Keith Morgan, and our guest is Mark Sokol, and we're going to be talking about anti-gravity. And when we come back, we will pick up where we left off, and hopefully it will be a really good show tonight.
one of the ways that this organized crime system has been able to monopolize the media and has been able to control the government and control perception on a wide scale is because it's the banks at the core, and they've been given the privilege of creating money out of thin air using a technique called fractional reserve banking, where the central banks backstop the money center banks to create money out of thin air. So when you go to get a loan, whether it's a mortgage or a car loan, that's not depositor money that they're loaning you. They just credit your account with some dollar credits and you're off to the races. And then you spend the rest of your life paying interest on a mortgage that somebody created out of thin air. And that's the reason why the bank is the largest building in every city on the planet, because they're making outrageous profits by getting to loan money at interest that they created out of thin air. This is Etienne de la Boétie Squared, the author of Government, the Biggest Scam in History, Exposed. And some of my favorite conversations are the ones that I have on the other side of the news with Timothy, Annetta, and Cynthia. Thank you for doing what you do and providing the service that you provide.
And welcome back to the other side of midnight. I'm Keith Morgan, and I'm sitting in for Richard C. Hoagland tonight. Our guest is Mark Sokol, and we're having a great conversation about anti-gravity and a whole bunch of things wrapped up in between. So, Mark, when you want to pick up where you left off?
Yes, we were talking about electrical currents. So I've actually had this conversation before with other physicists in the field. Depending on how you define electrical current, you can make the you can claim that a magnet does have a current running through it, or that could also not be claimed. Depends on how you define an electrical current. The definition on Wikipedia is that it's an electrical current is a stream of charged particles, such as electrons or ions, moving through an electrical conductor or space. While there are charged particles, such as electrons, moving through objects without any voltage being applied to them, such as you look at pyrolytic graphite that has a very high electron drift velocity. The electrons are moving around inside the material at very high rates of speed without any actual voltage being applied to it. This is called the electron drift velocity, and they have a very high one at room temperature. If you can somehow tap into that and make that a coherent current, then you might be able to create a thermoelectric converter, which is something that would cool down as it releases energy, which would solve the world's energy crisis, something we talked about before the show. There's a couple other ways to look at that problem. But basically, electrons moving through a conductor is how we define a current. Now, electrons are always spinning around at the speed of light around in the different bands around the atoms. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about electron jumping from atom to atom or from molecule to molecule within the material. And that's what creates the current. Now, the way we're reading the current is we're seeing the magnetic field lines that are created by the movement of the electron. Because the electron, when it goes from atom to atom, it's sort of spinning around like a spiral. That creates a spin orientation for the electron, or a magnetic moment, or magnetic direction. When you have a magnetic field, what you're really dealing with is spin orientation of the electron field. The stronger the field, the better oriented it is. The weaker the field, the less oriented it is, less coherent it is. And theoretically, there should be an upper limit to which magnetic fields can't get any stronger because it's perfectly oriented. You follow so far?
Yep. I did have electronics in high school, and my father was a master electrician. And I did work for ABC News for 30 years as an electronics technician. So I understand everything you're talking about. Ohm's law, Maxwell, all of those guys. Yeah, I got it. But it's our audience that we have to educate on this. So
exactly. I just want to make sure that I'm breaking it down to, the simplest level possible. Have you heard of rotational magnetic fields? It's a third form of electricity.
That's used for induction, right? Or just something different that I'm...
Well, it's a form of electricity. Like if you were to have magnets moving through space with orientations pointing outward, you would create a spinning magnetic field in space-time that cannot be shielded against. No Faraday cage, no lead, no nothing can shield against it. It's also possible to affect objects that are not magnetic in nature, like plastics and wood, can actually be affected by these types of fields.
Does this have something to do with the Hutchinson effect?
No, the Hutchinson effect involves using high voltage mixed with microwaves to reach some resonance points. We're actually in contact with John Hutchinson, but he's a very interesting, or he or she, I might add, is a very interesting figure that it's kind of hard to connect with. But we'll get into the Hutchinson effect in a little bit. But essentially the way I look at electric fields or magnetic fields is spin orientation of the electrons. So when we're dealing with a device like the gravitator, which we were talking about earlier, which is a parallel plate capacitor that T. Townsend Brown claimed would move in the direction of the positive charge, maintain that position for a little bit, and then it would slowly fall back to the center because it was hanging on a rope or something like that. And this is with the charge maintained, and he said there was no ion wind effect going on there. I tried to replicate this experiment. At first, we did see effects, but it turns out they were electrostatic in nature. Electrostatic repulsion we were dealing with. We had to eliminate certain wires and reorient the experiment. I did get it to a point where at around 60,000 volts with using an incense stick to measure ion flow to see if there's any wind, we were able to see that there was no wind flow. We did not see any effect once we were able to correct for all the issues. But there was a couple things we didn't do right, and I've only learned that they were relevant recently through my work with APEC, the Alternative Propulsion Engineering Conference, and learning what other teams that are working with DARPA and NASA, other teams were working on. It turns out that T. Townsend Brown was using litharge, or lead oxide powder, inside his dielectric material in between the plates. And the reason why that was important is because when you have a static electric field that's on a plate, it's different than if you have the static electric field contained inside the material from every single little atom of lead oxide that's contained around, it's contained in wax. It's very different when it's contained inside the material versus when it's on the just on the surface of the plate. And that may have contributed to the effect. I have seen other people replicate the experiment and were able to see some effect. And this is what's known as the Byfield-Brown effect. There's a big misnomer out there that the ion lifter devices are Byfield-Brown effect. No, that's not true. The only time that Byfield was ever mentioned in a patent was the patent number 300-311. It's a British patent where T. Townsend Brown was actually working with Byfield, and that was with the gravitator experiment. All the later stuff that came, with the ion lifters and the large discs that he experimented with in France, those came much later. Those are not Byfield Brown. So that's where that experiment left off. I also tried another version of it using slanted sawtooth waves. Now, you might probably heard a lot about those from Tom Vallone, if you've ever had him on from Integrity Research. Basically, the idea is to have a waveform that goes up rapidly and then falls down slowly. I came up with this idea looking at the Podkolov gravity impulse experiment, which Eugene Podkolov claimed that he took a superconducting disk and charged it up rapidly using a Marx generator, which is basically a lightning bolt machine, and charged it up to like millions of volts, and had it discharged through a vacuum chamber to an object that had very slow electron drift velocity, such as silver or copper. And in the process, he created an impulse that was gravitational in nature, meaning it would go through every object in its path. It was laser-like. It did not weaken in any measurable way for as far as they can measure it. And most importantly, every time they would multiply, they would double the voltage of the impulse, of the electrical impulse. The gravitational impulse's output would go up tenfold. So when you have an effect like that, where it's times 2 and you're getting times 10 out, you're obviously able to create an effect off of that, because if you were to pulse it faster in one direction than the other, there would be a net effect in one direction. It would be like pulse, but...
Are you familiar with John Searle and the Searle generator?
Oh, I'm very familiar with John Searle and the Searle generator.
Okay.
I talked to Jason Verbelli and what's his name? Russell Anderson. I actually interviewed him last weekend at Tesla Tech in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We were talking about the Searle generator in great detail. My personal belief is that the Searle effect generator is a hoax. I don't believe, I don't believe it at the moment. I'm pretty skeptical about stuff like that, because the amount of money that's been poured into it, both here in the U.S. and the Russians spent a lot of money on it as well. They did not see the kind of effects that were claimed by John Searle. John claimed that as a teenager working in his dad's mechanic shop, he was able to build this device with lots of very complex magnetic fields, and every time you talk about it, the manufacturing, the engineering just gets more and more complex.
From what I understand, he built this when he was working for a company to build generators, and he was self-taught, and he used what he called the law of the squares to actually put this together. And if those magnets in the cylinders that are holding themselves just above the copper rings are going around at the speed that they're going, shouldn't inertia make those things fly away? Or you're saying that's not what's happening here? These magnets, rollers that are going around the copper ring are not really doing that?
Well, just from the perspective of he claims that he built it while he was a teenager working in. I thought it was his father's shop, but you're telling me he was working at
a generator factory that built generators.
Yeah, that could be true, but still, he was able to build this device and get it to work back then, and he claims that it flew through the ceiling and up into space, and he can never find it again. And
it didn't fly through the ceiling. He was sitting at the kitchen table where his landlady was there in the kitchen, and it went into this super cool effect because when you pull more energy out of it, it doesn't get hot, it gets cooler, and it gets to a superconductive point where then it rose up and got stuck on the ceiling, and when he went to pull it down, his hands virtually almost froze to it until he shut it down. But when he had it outside and he was doing this stuff, then he created what he called the levity disk, and then it would go off into space someplace until he would learn how to control it. And then he set up some kind of radio control. He sent one around the world using radio relays.
I mean,
he's got a book. I read the book, and I think he's telling the truth. It's just we're not at a point to be able to accept what he's telling us. But if his technology comes out, it's going to be a game changer in terms of not only anti-gravity, but also in terms of energy generation. And it's not a free energy device.
Yes.
It's not a free energy
device.
No,
it's a thermoelectric converter. Yeah, if that is true of it getting cold, that is very, very exciting because if you're able to convert heat directly into electricity, that is the solution that will solve our energy crisis. Imagine turning on your air conditioner in the summer, and instead of it sucking energy out of the grid, you're actually pumping energy into the grid. And during the winter, you'd have these energy plants on the shore cooling off the ocean water. That would solve the world's energy problem once and for all if we had such a device. And there are, theoretical concepts or very very cutting edge experiments that have shown that it is possible using a two-diode system.
Did you know that
what is essentially the Maxwell's demon?
Okay. Did you know that there's at least 3 guys who have room temperature superconductors at 57 degrees Fahrenheit, not minus 57 or 70 minus 70, 57 degrees Fahrenheit, superconductive. And they have found out that graphene, which is a 1-atom thick layer of graphite, that is superconductive at superconductive temperatures of minus 70 or whatever. But if you take a second graphene layer and you lay it over top of the first graphene layer, but you offset it by just a little bit on degrees, that takes the temperature coefficient up even higher from like minus 70 up to minus 50. You put a third layer on it, it goes up even higher. So these 3 guys that I'm still researching and trying to find, they have superconductive devices that are at room temperature of 57 degrees Fahrenheit. So
there's also the University of of Rochester recently created room temperature, but at very high pressures.
Yeah,
a room temperature superconductor. That was a major discovery just recently in the past couple of months. There's also a claim that monoatomic or very thin layers of bismuth are superconducting. The thing about bismuth is the strongest diamagnetic material. And for those who don't know, diamagnetism is the effect where you apply a magnetic field, you have an opposing magnetic field created inside the material. The reason for this is that the electron drift velocity inside the material is higher than the magnetic field spin rate. So when the spin orientation happens, it actually opposes that magnetic field. The bismuth is the strongest naturally occurring material for diamagnetism. And the only known usage for bismuth at the current time is in Pepto-Bismol, which we take for an upset stomach. Bismuth is also pretty rare. It's about 2 times as common as gold. So if we found any reason to use bismuth in an anti-gravity craft, the price of bismuth would probably shoot up at the rate that Bitcoin has. It would be like buying Bitcoin at $2. Bismuth is an interesting thing to look at. We tried creating those really thin layers of bismuth. The issue is you got to do that in a vapor deposition chamber. Bismuth is a very difficult material to work with, which is why there's almost no use for it. Very difficult material to work with. It creates crystals very quickly. The crystals break this superconducting effect if it truly exists in the first place. So but we're still unsure whether that's true or not.
But it does get your antacids down in your stomach, right?
Yeah, it is kind of good at working at your antacids and all that. I'm sure they could find some other material to do that if it turns out that bismuth had some other use. But that's another material to look at. Of course, pyrolytic graphite is even more diamagnetic than bismuth. That is not a naturally occurring material. It could happen naturally near like a thermal event, like a geyser or something like that. If you had some graphite near a geyser, you might end up with pyrolytic graphite, but it's not something that's commonly found in nature. That is actually diamagnetic enough to float, and there's also a lot of materials that are very close to superconducting at plasma levels, meaning at very hot levels. Like you look at the plasma of mercury, that is pretty darn close to being superconducting. But what we found with, at least what Podkunov claimed with his superconducting disk experiments, he was using YCBOs, or yttrium barium copper oxides, that the superconductor was not actually necessary. It was it improved the effect slightly, but using materials like pyrolytic graphite, you can get the same effect at room temperature. It's all about how the electron is moving around. And think of it this way. Einstein told us that the theory of relativity, that objects that are moving at light speed have these different effects, have these relativistic effects. We're made out of objects that are moving at light speed. They're just spinning around in circles. The electrons are spinning around essentially at light speed around the atom. So if you can manipulate those in certain ways, you can, use relativity to push or pull against space-time. You can use those effects to have something to grab onto in order to move forward, which is something that Richard Van Derek is working on a DARPA grant right now.
There's a company called Quantum Magnetics, and they're actually promoting their electric motor and a generator, and the electric motor is powered from these graphite plates that have some electrolyte in between the two sandwich plates, and they charge themselves up and deliver like 5 or 6 amps. And if you give them like 4 seconds, they'll charge back up. So they set it up so that they feed a supercapacitor bank or ultracapacitor bank to help take the load off the plates. And they stack the plates, I think, in parallel or series to get enough current and voltage to be able to run the motor. And they pulse the motor 7 seconds on, 4 seconds off, 7 seconds on, 4 seconds off. And these plates continuously provide power, and they're not getting charged up. They're just charging themselves up. And I'm wondering, have you heard of that, or have you seen this company doing this?
No, we try to keep a distance from the free energy folk. Although what you're talking about sounds like it might be a thermoelectric converter. I hope that it is. The thing is that field has had so many hoaxsters and charlatans that, and I've met a few of them. The thing is that every venture capitalist, or many venture capitalists, have a free energy fund. They got that, the 0 point energy fund. They got the money. They're interested in investing. They want to figure out that problem. Not many of them have a UFO fund. They're not looking to figure out anti-gravity. I guess it's just too far-fetched for them or something. So there's a lot of incentive to people to try and get into that field and make some money. The thing is that every time we've looked at something like that, you look at it deeper and deeper, and you eventually find that there's some trick involved there. They're fooling the meter. The energy's coming from somewhere else, and the easiest person to fool is yourself. So don't think just because the guy's so sincere, he's telling the truth. He might be telling the truth that he thinks is true, but we've never seen true free energy that really shook our pants off. Anyways, moving back to anti-gravity, or trying to figure out how these flying saucers operate. So we tried the gravitator experiment. The next thing I wanted to try was the slanted sawtooth wave version of it. It's not very easy to create a slanted sawtooth wave. There are no amplifiers that off the shelf can create those kind of effects. One thing I wanted to do was to use a vacuum tube, control it via fiber optics, and had just a high voltage DC source, and then you'd be pulsing that DC source into something that has some sort of resistor or something like that that can drop the voltage, so you be able to put in a subsequent pulse. And I set it up. It worked. The scale that I was using to measure any weight loss went haywire and started showing me like 70 grams of weight loss. I don't trust the numbers on that scale because they were all over the place. Also, I found out later that the vacuum tubes that I was using had a maximum power output of just a couple watts. So I went back to the drawing board and searched online for a better vacuum tube, and I found that Berkeley Labs linear accelerator was being decommissioned, and they were selling the vacuum tubes online, and those had a power output of 186 megawatt impulse. So picked up a couple of those and got them wired up. So we're just about ready to try that impulse version of the gravitator experiment, which would possibly show us some effect. And these would all be thrust. Later on, we'll get into the inertial mass dampening devices with the Alzafon experiment, which is something that I'm knee-deep in working on right now. That's a very exciting experiment that the government has looked into, and it's something that can really explain how these flying saucers operate. We can get that going.
Okay. We're about 30 seconds out from our break. So when we come back, we'll pick up from there and try to stick on the topic of anti-gravity. But all of it comes together with a lot of other strange things that are coming out now, like the quantum glass battery and so forth. It's somehow all related. So let's pick up where we left off when we come back, okay? All right. So you guys, we're on the other side of midnight, and our guest is Mark Sokol. I'm your host, Keith Morgan, in place of your regular guest, Richard C. Hoagland. And we'll be back after the break, and I'm hoping you're enjoying this show because I am having a great time.
theothersideofmidnight.com. Join Richard C. Hoagland and an array of fascinating guests as we explore real-world topics and events through the lens of hyperdimensional physics. Join Club 19.5 to gain access to hundreds of archived shows. Only $9.95 per month. Listen in each Saturday and Sunday to the most compelling and thoughtful broadcast heard in over 160 countries around the world. Real research, real data, real science. The Other Side of Midnight.com.
The Other Side of Midnight.com. Talk radio, with pictures on demand. Liberate your hyperdimensional timescale, and non-linearly access over 400 hours of conversation at the cutting edge of science and thought. Join Club 19.5 to get access to exclusive content that fits your interests and time schedule. Filter episodes by guest or subject. Membership costs $9.95 a month, 33 cents a day. Talk radio, with pictures on demand. The Other Side of Midnight.com.
And welcome back to The Other Side of Midnight. And we're going to pick up with our anti-gravity because this is getting really good. I live talking science. And our guest, Mark Sokol, we're going to pick up and get back where he left off. So, Mark, go ahead and continue.
Yes. Okay, so we were talking about the sawtooth wave generator, which is one of the projects I'm currently working on. We got the Klystron out of the Berkeley Labs linear accelerator when they were decommissioning it. Of course, you buy all this kind of equipment at the anti-gravity research website known as eBay. It's the best place to buy this kind of random stuff. I could see you laughing there. You know it's true. There's nothing like eBay.
Egbay.
Also Craigslist. We got a couple stuff off of Craigslist as well, but those are just lucky chance things. So we got that Klystron powered up. Which Klystron is Thyratron powered up. Thyratron is basically a high voltage switch that allows for massive amounts of high voltage current to flow through it for a short amount of time, and you control it using a grid voltage. Basically, we have this whole thing powered up using just a battery and controlling it via fiber optics, so we can pulse the fiber optics and get whatever kind of output pulses we want. And then by completing the circuit on the other end, we're able to get that slanted sawtooth wave and hopefully see some effects. Another thing we're looking at, which I have some equipment on the way, is standing waves. Now, this gets into RF territory, radio frequencies. Basically, every object has a resonant frequency or several resonant frequencies. And an object that would have a near perfect single resonant frequency would be a plate, or like a circle, like a circular plate. And if you look at a flying saucer, it's two plates together, it's two saucers, so there is a perfect resonant frequency to that object. Now, when you have a resonant frequency emanating out of the device, you're going to put the antenna input in the center. You'd basically end up with these waveforms on top of the plate that are static. They're not really moving around, they're just there in space. Now, those fields, a magnetic field or an electric field that emanates from an object, is no longer attached to the object. It is standing in space-time. It is hosted by space-time. It is held there by space-time. It belongs to space-time, pretty much. And if you are able to pull or push against it, you're going to be pulling or pushing against space-time itself. And that would be a theoretical method of creating an alternative propulsion device or a reactionless propulsion device. So that's something that we are currently looking at. When I was at Tesla Tech just last week for Tesla Tech 2021, and I gave a speech on Friday the 13th, Um, One of the earlier speeches, people were talking about these different devices and stuff, and meanwhile, I was on my phone looking through eBay, trying to find if there was any RF amplifiers out there for my next great experiment. And suddenly, there were 6 of them available, all from one seller. I've never seen this seller before. He happens to be 20 miles away from the hotel. And so I naturally reached out to him and went down to go check out all the goodies that he had. And it turns out that these were decommissioned from Sandia National Labs, where they probably used them for anti-gravity research back in the 50s or 60s or 70s. Equipment is quite old. It's one-of-a-kind, RF amplifying devices I couldn't find anywhere else. You can't buy this kind of stuff new anymore. So I picked up a couple pallets worth of that stuff. One of the interesting things was they had some pulsed microwave amplifiers for sale. And pulsed microwaves, by the way, which is what is used in radar and also the Alzafon experiment, which I'll be getting into shortly, is a method that we can potentially explain flying saucers with. Or dynamic nuclear orientation, which creates this inertial mass shielding or gravity shielding effect. And the company that manufactured it was named Space. And the seller told me that he's never seen that company before. He thinks they were built internally at Sandia Labs for a specific purpose. So it's very exciting that we were able to get a hold of all that equipment and set it up here in the lab for these experiments in the future. By the way, if anyone is interested in working with us on anti-gravity research, we are open source. We, as a team, believe that the fundamental science behind anti-gravity or whatever makes these flying saucers operate is not patentable. It's not IP, can't be owned by anyone. It's a fundamental law of physics that has been overlooked or, at best, or intentionally hidden to the detriment of mankind. And as such, before going into a commercial environment where we're going to be manufacturing craft using whatever technology is found to work, we will be, showing everyone what does work, and moving on from there, into this new world. The industry that will be created from the discovery of anti-gravity, or by anti-gravity, I mean whatever makes flying saucers operate. I'm not talking about something that specifically pushes against gravity.
Most people look at anti-gravity as a transportation system, but it actually has more potential to be able to do other things like provide energy and so forth. But I'm
not so sure about that. But
you don't think so?
We'll see when we figure it out. I talked earlier with you off the record about how that could possibly work. Like, let's say an inertial mass cancellation device was discovered. We could make this massive object, 100,000 tons, become weightless. Then we could shoot it off into outer space. And as it returns, we'll be able to siphon that energy and, create free energy, quote unquote. But really what we're doing is we're shifting Earth's orbit. We might want to shift Earth's orbit. We might want to get a little farther away from the sun to cool things down a bit. That's another conversation. But that's essentially where that energy is coming from. It's not really free energy. None of the devices that I've ever looked at have any free energy, parts to them.
Have you seen Sapphire and Brilliant Lights technologies? Sapphire is using electromagnetic energy. The principle is that the sun is not a fusion reactor, which I think is true. Is not a fusion reactor, but is working off of rotating mass, and the more mass you have, the more energy is shunted across from other dimensions. That's why Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus are all putting out more energy than they're getting from the sun. And I remember Admiral Truly, when Hoagland and I were setting up the Enterprise mission at Dunbar High School in D.C., Truly came down to talk to the students, and he says, we're coming up on Neptune with the Voyager spacecraft, and when we get there, we're going to find this big frozen ball of gas, because the planet's so far away from the sun, it's frozen solid. And I raised my hand and said, excuse me, I wouldn't say that if I were you, because what we are learning from Cydonia and some ancient writings from Mesopotamia, Samaria, that the sun is some kind of hyperdimensional shunt, and rotating mass reaches into other dimensions and shunts energy across. And mathematicians have calculated that a key signature of one dimension folding into another one will yield a hexagonal pattern. So when they send Voyager over the pole of Saturn, they see this perfect hexagonal cloud pattern. The clouds are going in the opposite direction of the rotation of the planet at over 300 miles an hour. They go to the corners of the hexagonal and they turn. And I don't think we have anything in our physics that can actually explain that. But then they sent a probe.
About
the hexagonal cloud pattern around the pole of Saturn. But then they sent a probe over the pole of Jupiter. And what did they see? Oh, not a hexagonal pattern, but you've got 6 vortices evenly spaced around the pole of Jupiter. If you connect the centers with straight lines, you got what? Hexagonal. So what's going on? I'm willing to bet you if we had a probe on Ulysses, which is going around the poles of the sun, I bet you if it looked down at the poles, I bet you would see some kind of hexagonal flame pattern or 6 vortices evenly spaced around the pole, representing that's where the energy is doing its inwelling. I can't prove it because I'm not in charge of taking the pictures. But you see where I'm going, right? Rotating mass. The more mass you have, the more energy is shunted across. Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus are all putting out more energy than they're getting from the sun. And NASA's scratching their heads and butts going, oh, we don't know where the energy's coming from. It's probably nuclear. No, this is how the universe works. We were told that the sun is not a fusion reactor.
I would agree with NASA. I would agree with NASA on that. There's probably some nuclear stuff going on inside of Jupiter. I was actually just watching just earlier tonight, just a couple hours ago, watching
Neptune's putting out
the Juno project.
But Neptune's putting out 2.7 times more energy than it's getting from the sun as well. They said it was going to be frozen. You've got a dark spot on it sitting at 19.5 latitude. You've got clouds. You've got the fastest winds in the solar system of over 700 miles an hour. It's an active planet. It's not frozen solid. So where is that energy coming from? These large gaseous planets could have been suns if they had a little bit more mass. It's working on an electromagnetic scale. The sun is doing the same thing. There are fusion byproducts that take place with the workings of the sun, but they're not what's powering the sun. That's why they can't find all the neutrinos supposed to be streaming from these fusion reactions going on. Okay? We were told by the Palladians the sun is not a fusion reactor. You don't know about the Palladians. That's another story.
Yes,
you do?
I'm well aware. I'm well aware of the Palladians. Yeah, and Billy Meier. That was one of my early. I think he was the real deal. Just looking at the amount of disinformation agents that actively went down there and tried to discredit him, sticking fake photos in and building models trying to replicate it. So, for anyone looking on the surface of the Billy Meier case, might think, "Oh, this guy is a fraud." But as soon as you dig deeper, you realize that the frauds are the people who were trying to discredit him. And I
just saw a video released.
Mr. Targ.
So, what is this called? The third phase of Moon released a video. They said this is the clearest shot we've ever seen of one of these saucers. And I'm looking at it, and they said it kind of looks like Billy Meier's stuff. And I said, yes, it is Billy Meier's stuff. That's a beam ship. He shot it with his 8mm film footage, and somebody took it in, cleaned it up, got the scratches or whatever out of the video, and posted it as their stuff. No, that's Billy Meier's
Oh,
stuff.
let's get back to Billy Meier's explanation. The Semyazi and Aztec and all the people that were teaching Billy Meier supposedly about how the world works and everything, they wanted to stay away from the technological aspects of how the craft worked, but they did give him a rough overview of what was happening. They said that the craft first, they call it a beam ship because they use a beam of light as propulsion, because light does have a propulsive effect. It's actually Newtonian physics, because for every reaction there's an equal and opposite reaction. But we're talking about grams or micrograms of thrust with a very bright light. So that is enough thrust for some reason to get the craft moving at the speed of light. And then there's a shielding effect around the craft that shields them from the relativistic effects of getting heavier and all the things that would happen at the speed of light. Then they remove that shield, and the craft converts all of the energy, the matter in the craft, into it energizes it somehow and takes it into another dimension where they're able to then travel in that other dimension instantaneously to any point or time in the universe. They make sure not to do that close to any planets because that transition can shift a planet's orbit, which is why their traveling takes so long, because most of the time they're just trying to get away from us in order to have that transition happen. But looking through all of the literature, I found one experiment in particular that is more exciting than the rest, that could actually explain how all of this stuff happens. It can explain how flying saucers are able to move as quickly as they do and do 90-degree turns at 10,000 miles an hour. And most importantly, it's able to explain why certain things that flying saucers can't do. Have you ever noticed that a flying saucer cannot do a barrel roll?
Yeah, I haven't seen one of those happen yet.
Have you?
Actually,
Nope, it's not.
there was
F-16 can do it.
there was a photograph taken in 1966. It was actually two photographs. The two brothers took of this, looked like a double pie pan, deep dish pie pan saucer, one on top of the other, and they took one picture looking at it from the side, with vertical. Then the next picture, it was turned up on its bottom, it's on the edge, and you can see the bottom of it. And on the bottom was this symbol. And in 1984, when the Voronezh incident took place, these kids drew pictures of what they had seen. And on the side of the craft, there was this symbol. And I talked to Koppel about it, and I said, I've seen the symbol somewhere before. And I went and got my book, and I found that symbol, that picture on the bottom of that book. And that was like, these kids couldn't have made this up in 1984. Or was it, 1989. Because the internet didn't exist. It was the ARPANET, but the Russian kids didn't have access, something like that. How did they come up with this symbol to put on the side of this craft and on the belt buckles of the extraterrestrials? They said, come out, it saw come out of this thing. And it was just wild that this coincidence just happened to take place. But the brothers took the picture and this thing was on its side. So it wasn't a quite full barrel roll, but it was turned on its side.
Right. Okay, it can turn, it can shift its orientation, but it happens slowly, and there's a very there's a salient explanation to why that is the one movement it can only do very slowly. And this comes back to what we call the Alzafon experiment. So I first discovered or heard about the Alzafon experiment after going live on YouTube on Jeremy Reese's Alien Scientist channel. And somebody in the comments posted a link to a book by Frederick Alzafon's son, David Alzafon, which is available on Amazon. It's called Anti-Gravity with Present Technology. It was based on a paper that Frederick wrote in 1981. So this has been around for quite some time, 30 years already. And he had applied for a patent already for this technology. put out a paper. It was peer-reviewed for the Advanced Propulsion Conference in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And he theorized, after learning Einstein's theory of relativity and special relativity from one of the people who understood it best, at least according to Einstein, he found a couple holes in it and wanted to theorize that gravity was actually an electromagnetic interaction between subatomic particles. What do we know about gravity that is indisputed is that it comes from the core of the atom. It's not coming from the electrons, it's coming from mass. There's a direct correlation between mass and gravitic interaction. The denser the mass is, the more concentrated the gravity is. It's always attractive. The state of the matter does not change the gravitic effect, meaning the temperature or the magnetic properties do not change how strong the gravitic effect is, at least as far as we can tell. So it's coming in the core of the atom. What do we have in the core of the atom? We have these subatomic particles, which are essentially electromagnetic energy or light that's spun around on itself. Now, when you have energy that's spun around on itself, you end up with a gyroscope or gyroscopic effect. Now, we learned from Boeing, from Mike Gamble at Boeing, who's actually working on this for 20 years. He presented at APEC a couple of times, the Alternative Propulsion Engineering Conference, that gyroscopes, complex gyroscopic spins, can convert angular momentum, meaning the spinning energy of the gyroscope, and the changes of the gyroscope's axis itself, meaning the spin of the spin, can change angular momentum, spinning energy, into linear momentum. You can create propellantless propulsion using complex gyroscopic spins. They've never achieved more than like 10% thrust to weight ratio, so you're not seeing anything taking off with this technology. But there are devices in space, satellites that use this type of technology in order to maintain their orbit. And we're actually building several prototype devices using gyroscopes to create this sort of propellantless propulsion. But the concept is, if you have complex gyroscopic spins in the core of the atom, and you were to move that atom from point A to point B, aka linear momentum, that would change the spin orientation of the subatomic particles. That is the source of inertia. So if you have the source of inertia being the complex gyroscopic spins of the in the core of the atom, the way to get rid of the inertia is to remove the complex spins, make them all oriented in the same direction. And by doing so, you're creating coherent matter. You're creating matter that is all spinning in the same direction. The axes are all pointing in one direction. And if you ever held a gyroscope in your hand, you'll see that it's free to move along its plane and its axes without any resistance. But if you try to change the axes, the axis spin direction, you'll see that you'll be pushing against forces at a 90 degree to that change of movement, which is what we see with flying saucers, that they are able to zip off along the axes and along the plane of the craft, but they're not able to change that axis very rapidly, because in order to change the axis, let's say the craft weighed 10 tons in a normal sense, but if you got rid of all the mass of the craft through dynamic nuclear orientation, through orienting the subatomic particles, the craft now weighs a couple of grams along its plane and axes. If you wanted to shoot off in a different direction than what the axis was pointing at, you would have to then move 10 tons of mass into a new orientation, and then you'd be free to fly off in that new direction. And the craft use many different methods to achieve that small amount of thrust that they need, because dynamic nuclear orientation or this inertial mass cancellation effect does not provide thrust. It just makes the craft weightless. This can also explain how the pyramids were built, how the sea was split during the Exodus, and lots of other effects that have boggled science throughout the years. Namely, how could you make the pyramids? Well, if you can make things weightless, that makes things a lot easier. This also explains why flying saucers, when they're operating near the ground, they can disturb the ground below them, because the ground is becoming weightless in itself. But essentially what we're doing is creating nuclear magnetism. We're bringing spin orientation, instead of the spin orientation of the electrons, we're bringing it down to the proton-neutron level in the core. So we're creating nuclear magnetism. Like electromagnetism is spin orientation of the valence electrons. Nuclear magnetism, spin orientation of the core. A laser, for instance, is a coherent light. We're creating coherent matter in order to get rid of the inertial effects and make a craft weightless. Now, Einstein famously said that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. Now, to rephrase that, the only thing that can travel faster than the speed of light is nothing. So first we have to make the craft weigh nothing, and then we can travel faster than the speed of light. And when you're moving faster than the speed of light, you probably be able to move through time as well. This explains in some way how the craft that Semyazi and Billy Meier were traveling on works, because they got going up to the speed of light. They had some sort of shield effect. And that shield effect is something we will get into at the next segment. It's actually a very interesting thing that involves, of all things, a 3M plant here in the United States. And also the arrows that the Egyptians were firing at the Jews in the Old Testament came flying right back at the Egyptians. That's according to the Old Testament account. That is, those things are actually related, and we'll get into that after the break. But
okay.
The Alzafon experiment essentially uses EPR to achieve this dynamic nuclear orientation, or electron paramagnetic resonance. That is something similar to what you find in an MRI machine or a magnetic resonance imaging machine. Start off with a homogeneous or a laminar magnetic field, which is essentially spin orientation of the valence electrons, and then you pulse the electrons at their precession rate, which is the spin of the axes, which is way up in the gigahertz range. It depends on how strong the magnetic field is. It's a direct correlation between the strength of the magnetic field and the Larmor precession, which is the spin, the spin of the axes, or the precession of the axis. Now,
Okay.
Earth has a precession as well. Happens every 25,900 years. We call that the precession of the equinox. The electron's precession happens billions of times per second, depending on the strength of the magnetic field.
Okay.
And we energize that spin and use it to orient the core.
Okay, we're coming up on the break, and we lost Ron, so I got to get Ron back in as well. But I'm gonna.
Oh yeah, we love you, Ron.
I'm gonna bring up a subject. It may be a sore thumb, and it might not be, but we'll find out when we come back, and I'll ask you about it. Okay? So you guys, you're on the other side of midnight. I'm your host, Keith Morgan, sitting in for Richard C. Hoagland, and our guest is Mark Sokol, and we're talking anti-gravity and a whole bunch of little things stuck in between. But we're having fun. So as soon as we come back from this break, I'm going to ask Mark about a real controversy that's been around for a little bit and see how he thinks this technology that has been mentioned before works. Okay.
as you continue to work on yourself, the tribe comes forward. They'll come right to your door. So just keep doing the work and it'll come together. Yep, as you increase your frequency, then you become more mature in your manifestation abilities, and your other higher senses and gifts come online, and then you have more power to make your world different and better and how you want it. And so that's why working on yourself is so important, because then you're going to create the reality that you want rather than get sucked into the dystopia that's being created by the negative or shadow side. We're becoming Renaissance men and women where we have multiple skill sets and we can dance from science into art, and we can use both sides of our hemispheres, and we can realize how much we have to really offer and grow into. And this is what's happening now. This is where we're headed, into a really beautiful place. So we can rejoice in that despite the fear, despite what it looks like on the outside. This is how disease transforms. The mess in the chaos is necessary in order to see what you have before you, so you can clean it up and just make decisions to change your reality. If you don't see it, how do you know it's there to even be changed? Or if you ignore it, right? Then how can you make the differences? You can't. So the mess is before us, accept our mess, and now know that that's part of empowerment, to be able to see and to be able to transform it. Hi, this is Amanda Vollmer, and I was on the other side of the news, and I really enjoyed my time discussing deeper topics and really getting to the heart of truth and the things that matter in this world and what we are doing and why we're here and what we're heading toward. I really recommend listening in and learning, expanding your awareness and your knowledge. It's important, and these are the times to do it, and we're being asked to pay attention and to challenge ourselves and think beyond the box.
And welcome back to the other side of midnight. And we've been having a great conversation about anti-gravity with our guest, Mark Sokol. And we're going to pick that up, but I'm going to ask Mark about what he thinks about this one subject. Mark, you're familiar with Bob Lazar, right?
Oh, yeah. We could get into Bob Lazar in a minute, but can I just finish up the Alzafon experiment?
Sure, go ahead.
Because that's something that I'm actually working on at the moment, and it's pretty exciting. So before we were talking about creating this state of coherent matter where all the spins are going in the same direction. Now, there's a lot of ways to create spin orientation or dynamic nuclear orientation. I actually got the book on it. The latest book that's written on the subject was actually put out in the 60s and is barely available. So it's not something that's really taught in colleges anymore. EPR, or electron paramagnetic resonance, is a similar effect. What they're doing is hitting the electron at its Larmor precession at the frequency that the axis rotates, and that is directly correlated to the strength of the magnetic field. So there's a gyromagnetic ratio of 28.025 gigahertz per Tesla, meaning the stronger the magnetic field is, the higher the frequency of that precession. So what we need to do is get a homogeneous magnetic field. The sample material that we're going to be testing for weight loss, the entire sample sitting in a magnetic field of exactly the same strength. That's not an easy effect to achieve in a laboratory setting without building an entire ship, actually. You need a very large electromagnet, similar to what they have in hospitals for an MRI machine. So that was one of the hardest parts to achieve. And then you have to have microwaves that are pulsing. Normally in EPR, they have a continuous microwave impulse to just continuously be energizing it. But if you want to get the subatomic particles energized or oriented, you need to pulse the valence electrons, energize them a bit using their precession, and then they're able to transfer over that extra energy to the core using a process called hyperfine coupling. And you do this in pulses every couple of milliseconds. It depends on the temperature of the sample and the material that the sample is made out of. Frederick Alzafon recommended using aluminum or magnesium for this experiment because aluminum has a very high dynamic nuclear orientation retention time at room temperature. The colder you make the material, the longer they're able to maintain these nuclear effects, because temperature is basically just the molecules shaking around, and that induces randomness or incoherence. So we're using aluminum as he suggested. Also, we throw in a little bit of iron, talking around a 0.5% or 1% of iron in there, and that is to make sure that the magnetic field permeates the sample properly. Also, we're not dealing with a solid piece of aluminum because there's the skin effect, where RF frequencies don't get deep into the material. They only move along the skin. The higher the frequency, the thinner the skin effect. And so we're using powdered aluminum and iron inside of an epoxy material, which basically ignores the microwaves. In one of the first experiments we ran, we built, this is me and a fellow scientist, Jeremiah Popp, who's also self-taught engineer and physicist working on these kind of things. I met him through the Alien Scientist channel. And he came down to the lab here in Hawthorne, New Jersey, and we ran this experiment. One of the initial tests saw some positive results of around 17.8% weight loss. There was a lot of noise in the sampling because the microwaves that we're working with are pretty small. They're around 10 gigahertz or 2.5 centimeter wavelengths. And that was getting inside of the sample, the weight measuring tools, and we tried to shield against it. But there still was some residual effect there. But we did see something promising enough to continue. Also, the magnetic field that we were working with wasn't perfectly homogeneous. It was a home-built electromagnet, which was pretty insufficient for the experiment needed. Now we got a new electromagnet, weighs around a ton. And by a ton, I mean 2,000 pounds. And we got these really heavy-duty casters on it to be able to move it around the shop. Had to take it off of the truck using a forklift.
Mark?
And yes.
Mark, I'm swimming in a sea of jargon here. What was your experiment doing? You're giving me a progress report, but what was an experiment to try and do? Or was it a demonstration of concept? I just want to know where we're going here. Go ahead.
It's a proof of concept to show that this effect works. We were trying to see weight loss. Basically, we have this sample hanging inside the magnetic field, and we're bombarding it with pulsed microwaves at the Larmor frequency.
Okay, how is it hanging inside there?
Okay, they're asking very relevant questions. So, because
suspended on a wire,
it's suspended on not a wire. We're using a fishing line because a wire is ferromagnetic. It would interact with the magnetic field and screw around with that. So we also it needed a sort of a rig in order to keep it from flopping to the side, because the ferrous material wants to short out the magnetic field, and it would just turn to the side. So what we had to do is create this sort of dolly contraption with Basically rails, and it's all using PET-G plastic that is not affected by the microwaves, and more fishing line, with weights underneath in order to keep everything nice and easy, smack and center inside this saddle point so that it doesn't shift to either side, and we can get an accurate measurement. And we're not just looking at the effects of the strong magnetic field.
But can you? What kind of weight loss are you getting? You said 17.5% in that experiment. Is that typical? I mean, how do you translate this to a thrust?
You don't translate it to a thrust. The experiment, if it works properly, and if we were to scale it up, will not provide any thrust. It will just make secondary thrusts that you have from other propulsion devices much more relevant, because like there are devices like the Woodward device that works, that produces several milligrams of thrust, but you can't do anything with that to get a craft to lift, because the craft weighs several tons. But if you can get weighing several grams or something like that, and it's free to move along its plane and axes, then suddenly all these secondary thrust devices can get the craft moving at crazy speeds that we've seen.
Okay. And how are all the people on board the ship that you have this? Sounds like gravity plating from Star Trek, actually. I never understood what they were talking about, but
okay, Ron,
hold on. Thing you're talking about.
Ron, hold on a second. Okay, Mark, we talked about Bruce De Palma, remember? And he created the end machine that put out more than what was going in, but he also did an experiment, because I think it was George Adamski back in the day when he was an abductee or contactee. And he asked them, how did these craft function? And they said it was like based on two disks rotating in opposite directions. So Dr. Bruce De Palma took this concept where he had a heavy steel slab with two rods sticking up out at a distance apart. And on top of each of the rods, there were these flywheels or discs, and they were heavy steel flywheels. The whole thing weighed about 600 pounds, and he would start to turn these discs in opposite directions on the top of the rods. And he didn't have to get them going fast. He just had to get them going. And this 600-pound device would lose 6 pounds. And he called it his anti-gravity device. Now, he showed it to some people.
Yeah, that's gyroscopic. That's the gyroscopic effect that we talked about earlier.
Okay.
That works. I've seen it work. It's never achieved 100%, thrust to weight ratio. I think the best they've ever achieved was on the order of about 10%, and that was with Mike Gamble working at Boeing, and the device weighed around 1,500 pounds and was pushing over 100 pounds of thrust. So those devices do work. That's proven technology that we've replicated here in the lab, to some extent, and we're working on version 4 of that already. And at the lab here, we have quite a manufacturing capability. We've got a large Haas CNC machine and 3D printing and high voltage electronics. So like all of these experiments that you're thinking about, we can actually replicate them here. But getting back to the Alzafon experiment, the reason why it's so exciting is because it's the only experiment I've ever seen that can really explain how these flying saucers operate and make the other experiments, like the one you just mentioned with the gyroscopes, make that effect strong enough to actually get you into outer space, to actually move you, at these crazy velocities. Essentially, if you become weightless, you can make it to the moon with a can of hairspray. So first, let's get the craft weighing almost nothing. Well, we have this massive electromagnet around the sample in order to try to get that weightlessness happening. If this were to work, we would do it the other way around, which is we'd create a magnetic field inside the craft, then have the skin of the craft inside the homogeneous magnetic field lines, bombard those with microwaves from the outside. This way, the skin of the craft will both act as a Faraday shield protecting the occupants from the microwaves, and also it would provide the dynamic nuclear orientation which is necessary to make the craft weightless. Two designs come to mind. One is if you just use a large coil and follow the homogeneous field lines of it, you'd end up with a saucer-shaped device. So that would be the flying saucer shape. Another way to do it is to create a large, long coil and have the skin of the craft right outside of that coil. It's just like right on top of it. And that craft would look like a cigar shape, which is a pretty common shape. We've also seen it in the Old Testament, the pillar of fire and smoke that Jehovah flew around on. That was shaped like a cigar-shaped flying contraption. And that is probably one of the easiest designs to work with. I actually have over here the waveguides that we plan on using. We've got like a flexible waveguide in order to inject the microwaves into that experiment. This way we'll be able to see if there's any weight loss, because normally waveguides are like made out of solid metal. So we've got the flexible one to see if there's any weight loss on it.
Okay, so can I bring up that sore thumb again? Bob Lazar says that when he was working at S4, the theory that they had was that this element 115 was the power source and the wave generator for creating a wave that they threw out of phase with the Earth's wave in terms of gravity to give them the lift. So element 115 didn't exist at the time that he was telling people about this, but the Russians came along and they created element 115, which they called moscovium, and of course we call it ununpenium, but it's element 115 on the periodic table. He says
unobtainium.
Ununpenium, not
Tanium. Unobtainium. That's from Lazar.
Unattainium.
That's from Lazar.
Yeah, that's what he said.
It also has...
Ununpentium is the proper name, or moscovium. Unobtainium is a joke. It's between the words unobtainable, like you can't get it, and turning that into an element. It's any material that has such special properties that is almost impossible to make. About Bob Lazar, I've dove into that a couple of times, and Jeremy Ray, Salem scientist, he's actually gone to the point of making a website, boblazardebunk.com. Basically, I think Bob Lazar was telling the truth, but listen carefully to his story. He's not saying this is how it works. He's saying this is how I was told it works. Yeah. There's a strong distinction there. He didn't work there for very long. He was also a person that was known to blab his mouth, could have never possibly gotten a clearance to work in such a high security place in a serious manner. I think he was brought in as a disinformation agent, knowing that he would probably blab his mouth. And they just fed him a whole bunch of lies and showed him some real technology. So he knows that he saw something real, and he knows what they told him about it. But what they told him was complete and utter bullshit. Now let's dive into what they told him.
I think that's pretty good.
115. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I see where you're going.
Element 115. There's element 115, and they're bombarding it with a neutron source,
proton.
Well, tell everybody why. The mathematicians have this idea that there are little islands of stability higher up in the periodic chart,
that's not the issue. There's other issues that are just, flat out impossible. One thing in particular is his explanation of how it works. Element 115, he claims, is stable. We haven't found that isotope of element 115 that's stable yet. Let's say it exists, but okay, I'll give him that. But when you bombard it with this linear accelerator and turning it into element 116, he says that magically is antimatter. Now the problem is that antimatter.
Well, he said it gives off
is-
antimatter, which then falls down the tune chamber into matter. There's 100% annihilation. There's 100% thermocouple, which converts that energy directly to electrical energy, which runs the craft. He said the A wave extends outside the nucleus of the atom, and they take that A wave and they amplify it just like any other wave.
Let's get back to the beginning. Element 115 is changed into element 116, which is antimatter. If
It gives off antimatter, but
How could that have? He never said that. Not that. I mean, he said the transition part, but I don't. The antimatter part. I don't recollect that.
he
I heard
said
him speak several
elements 116 immediately starts to decay, giving off antimatter. Because that antimatter then falls down this tune chamber into the matter, and there's 100% annihilation, and that energy is converted through a 100% thermocouple, no such thing as we know, and that runs the electricity in the craft.
I mean, the
well, that's
100%,
complete bovine
thermo-
flatulence. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, the 100% thermoelectric converter might be possible. We've seen superconducting materials, so maybe there is a 100% thermoelectric converter, and I want one badly. But
Me too.
the main problem is making this antimatter, because antimatter starts off with antiprotons, anti-electrons, antiprotons and antineutrons. Anti-electrons are created in certain reactions. That is possible to make, but they're called positrons. Like lightning has some positrons and all that. But you're not going to turn regular matter into antimatter. It's simply not possible. The only place that we're making true antimatter is at CERN right now.
But
And
remember, he said he didn't.
Hydrogen.
He didn't turn it into antimatter. It decayed, giving off antimatter. That's a little bit different. So shooting the proton into
It's decaying back to it's decaying back to element 115.
I think they pumped it up and it turned into 116, which it then decayed back from almost immediately, and it gave off energy in the process. And because of the way that subatomic physics seems to work, that's more energy than the amount that they pumped into it to raise it to a higher state. But yeah, this stuff with the antimatters, that sounds conflated in there.
But he
somehow.
did say that
know.
the scientists tried to cut one of these reactors open, and it was a huge explosion.
That would be true.
That's why he was recruited, because
that story was.
Yeah,
that would be true even if that explanation was bullshit. But let's get back to the element 115 turning into element 116. If you add a proton into one element and turn it into the next element, and then it decays back, it's going to be releasing a proton out. It's not going to be releasing antimatter. That's just not the way we've ever seen any physics work.
Well, when we have radioactive material, it's giving off all kinds of not elements, but particles, right? That's what the radiation is.
Yeah.
But does the material return to the previous element just before it? Not for thousands of years or whatever, because it's still giving off this energy or particles.
Some materials.
No.
Back,
yeah.
Some do. Some turn back actually in fractions of a second. Everything is.
Yeah. Well, we've got the island of stability, where this material is stable enough where it doesn't give off any kind of particle radiation. But when you put the proton in and you go to element 116, then it gives off an equivalent of antimatter, and then it becomes stable again, because now it's 115 again. So I don't know whether he's telling the truth, but
I think he was saying that the element 116 is converged completely into antimatter. If I'm wrong on that, and you're saying that it just produces one proton, one antiproton out, and then you can combine that with a regular proton, then essentially what you're doing is you're taking a regular proton and you're doubling its energy. So you're putting in one proton, you get out two protons, if that is true. But that wasn't my understanding of his explanation. And it would be amazing if such a thing worked. Another interesting thing about element 115 is the element that's right above it, which is bismuth. In the same family, element 83 is the bismuth, which we talked about earlier, which is possibly superconducting. It's the strongest naturally occurring diamagnetic material. And that's something we're looking at deeply here at the lab. We got several pounds of it and been shaping it into several different shapes for various experiments. But that is one of my main issues with this whole Bob Lazar story, is the fact that he said that element 116 it becomes antimatter. That's hogwash. That never happens, and any that's impossible, basically, because the particles that make up the element 115 that we just added on another proton to, they're all regular matter spinning in one direction. You're not going to get them to spin in the other direction, and just by adding more regular matter. Another thing he said that was kind of interesting is when he was in the base of the craft, he saw these what they told him was gravity waveguides or tuned chambers, and he said they actually looked like microwaves. He said they looked like microwave waveguides, that's Alzafon. You got microwave waveguides running through the craft or through the skin of the craft, and making it weightless. So I saw some interesting synchronicities there, but that was one of the only things that they didn't tell him that was his own intuition from looking at the craft, which is why I say I think he was telling the truth and fed bullshit.
Yeah, that sounds good. I've faced some of that myself. You get an information source that tells you things that they don't realize that that what they're telling you is ridiculous, or contraindicated by something that is a common sense answer, and they want this information out there. I think you nailed it with Lazar, because I think he's basically sincere. He's certainly a very bright fellow, and this bit about waveguides.
Yeah. Well, did you guys know that he's supposed to have a portion of element 115, and when he did an interview. After he did that interview, it was like the FBI came in and raided his place for something else, but I think they were looking for the element 115. So,
right, and he says he doesn't have it around anymore. Yeah, I know. I heard him discussing that on with Art at one time or another. He claims he doesn't have it anymore, of course, but so would I.
He also claimed that he saw a device that they told him was the power supply. Or the reactor chamber, and he tried putting his hand close to it, and the closer his hand got, the stronger the
field got. Push his hand
away.
away.
It was like it was push his hand away, and that's something we'll get into in the next segment. That's an actual effect that can be replicated in the lab, and it's been seen as a shielding effect around these flying saucers. So, like, if you shoot a kinetic weapon at them, they'll come flying back right at you.
Okay,
so
guys, we're at the bottom of the break. Keep that thought, though, Mark, because this is getting good. Okay, and we'll be right back after we have this short break. Hopefully this will be a short break. And Ron will be back with us as well, because he got lost there for a second. You're listening to The Other Side of Midnight. I'm your host, Keith Morgan. Your guest is Mark Sokol, and my co-host is Ron Gerbon. Be back in a minute.
Richard C. Hoagland here. I'd like you to support The Other Side of Midnight by subscribing to Club 19.5 and thereby joining our unique and growing radio community. Tune in to listen to our fascinating guests, pioneers on the out there edge of science and thought, and gain access to exclusive member benefits. To do this, just visit our website, theothersideofmidnight.com, and click on the Join Club 19.5 link in the navigator bar or in the left-hand column. Membership costs $19.95 per month. That's 33 tetrahedral cents a day. I mean, it's the price of a couple of cups of coffee. As a Club 19.5 member, you'll gain access to this show and literally hundreds of previous shows on hundreds of different topics going back to 2015 that we have done. Our archive shows have the commercials removed, and you'll be able to download the MP3 files directly from the 19-point archives if you prefer. To enhance your listener experience, a new The Other Side of Midnight podcast is being added to all show pages, which will allow you to instantly search the show archives of Radio with Pictures, thus easily accessing the corresponding show. Plus, you can just as quickly access the entire podcast list when you're on the go. I want to personally thank all our Club 19.5 members because without your continuing support, this show would literally not be on the air. Please continue supporting the broadcast that provides you with the most interesting conversation available, talk radio at the cutting edge of science and thought, and if you like what you hear on The Other Side of Midnight, tell your friends, and continue growing the show by having them subscribe to Club 19.5 as well, because we need all of you. And when I say we need you, you're the reason we're doing all this. Hoagland, over and out.
theothersideofmidnight.com. Tune in to listen to Richard C. Hoagland and his fascinating guests. Join Club 19.5 to get access to exclusive member benefits. As a Club 19.5 member, you'll gain access to the rest of this show and all previous 350 episodes. Membership costs $9.95 a month, 33 cents a day. Support the broadcast that provides you with the most interesting conversation available. Talk radio at the cutting edge of science and thought. theothersideofmidnight.com.
And welcome back to The Other Side of Midnight. We're talking about anti-gravity tonight. Your host, sitting in for Richard C. Hoagland. And it hasn't been dull. It's been a great conversation going on. And we seem to have lost Ron, which I'm going to call back in a minute if he stops calling my cell phone. And he's co-hosting with us. So we're going to pick up where we left off. We were kind of talking about Lazar, and we were talking about element 115 and kind of things like that. But the technology, in terms of anti-gravity, there's a lot of different concepts and ideas about what actually produces it. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to open up Mark right now. You're pretty familiar with Salvador Payas's patent, correct?
Oh yeah, I've read a couple of those patents. I think they're pointing toward the Alzafon experiment. They talk about microwaves in the hull of the craft creating an inertial mass shielding effect or gravity shielding effect. So if it does actually work, it points toward, that Alzafon's theory of anti-gravity with present technology actually works, and that's what the Navy's been doing since the 50s.
Okay, we have some things posted that you in your section of theothersideofmidnight.com in tonight's show. There's images of the first image is of Can you see that on your browser? To get to the web page, you go to theothersideofmidnight.com. You click on tonight's show, the show banner, and it'll take you to the page that has the pictures for Mark's stuff. And the first picture says it's a superconductor bilayer gravity impulse experiment. Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, that's a YouTube video. Yeah, it's the superconductor bilayer gravity impulse experiment. This was an attempt at the Podkolonov gravity impulse experiment that I talked about earlier. It wasn't done completely to the letter of what Podkolonov claimed was necessary. It was missing some key components. Mm-hmm. But we did manage to impulse these superconducting materials with, I think it was around 10 or 15,000 volts, a lot of current. The Dewar practically exploded when that happened. We didn't see much of an effect. It needed to have been done inside of a vacuum, so there are lots of components that were missing. And I hope to do it correctly in the future and see if anything comes of that. But I definitely recommend anyone who's interested to watch those videos. It was edited by yours truly. It cut it down to about 12 minutes. And you can see all the pertinent parts of the experiment. This was also done live on the Alien Scientist YouTube channel. He actually came down to the lab. He's come down quite a few times. And we ran experiments live on YouTube, which is quite a feat because it's hard to get these experiments going and predict when they'll be ready. That's just one experiment we did. The next thing you'll see is a short history of anti-gravity technology. This was a presentation. It was actually the first in-person presentation that I was asked to give at Disclosure Network, New York. I'm right here in New Jersey, so that's just a short drive away.
That's Stephen Greer's disclosure project?
Yes, it's related to Stephen Greer's disclosure project. He was one of the he was inspired by Stephen Greer. I forgot who runs that show, but he asked me to give a presentation in February 16th originally of 2020. Then scheduling conflicts had me moved up to February 2nd. And if you look at the date, it's kind of an interesting date. It's 02/02/2020. It's like the the 2020 of 2020. And then it gets even crazier than that. It was supposed to start at 2 p.m., but the guy who was giving his presentation on the 16th wanted to give an introduction. So we started at 2:20 on 02/02/2020. So it was really, the synchronicities were lining up, and that's something I can get into a lot. It's a very interesting presentation, very well put together with nice slides. You can check that out on my YouTube channel as well. The next video you see over there is electrets. We were making electrets for an anti-gravity experiment. This is based off of Ron Kita. He claimed that electrets exhibit anti-gravity properties, like they lose weight when they're oriented in certain directions. We successfully created electrets, and for those who don't know, an electret is it's a static magnet. So there's an or a magnet is a spin orientation of the electrons inside an object, and they're locked in place, and that creates magnetism. You can also create electricity or electrical potential inside of a very high-strength dielectric material by melting the material or bringing it to its viscous state or slightly viscous state, applying a very high electric field. We're talking 70,000 volts or more of DC potential as it cools into its solid state. And by doing this, the molecules of the material become polarized by the electric field potentials, and it basically becomes a static magnet. The material doesn't have a potential for actually creating a continuous current thrust. You can't actually get electricity off of it, but you could by moving it in relation to other conductors. You can actually turn that energy directly into electricity, which is something that we've shown in the presentation. We turned off the lights. It's in there. You can see we're just basically lifting the the plate off of the electret off of a plate, and then there's an electric potential that built up, and you're able to short it out and get a little spark. And that energy was then transferred from lifting the electret, moving the electret around directly into electricity. So that's a pretty cool effect. We put the electret on a scale to see if there's any weight loss. As expected, there was electrostatic repulsion when the electret was close to the scale. That is true with any material. You'd expect electrostatic repulsion effects. But when we put a piece of dielectric, in this case, it was styrofoam cups that we used, between the scale and the electret, the weight measurement shouldn't change because you're just adding these styrofoam cups. But when we did that, the weight loss, if all but vanished, because there was no longer the electrostatic repulsion effect. So that is where we left off with that experiment. I don't think the electrets actually produce anti-gravity effects, but they can potentially work, with a direct thermal electric converter in some form or fashion. I would hope somebody can actually do something with that. And that's pretty much what we have going on the website right now.
Okay. Wow. So there's a video of I think he was Russian, and he
Alexei Chekhov.
Yeah, with the bee's wings and so forth.
Oh, Grabinikov.
Yeah.
Grabinikov. I think you're talking about Grabinikov. Okay, so that was one of the places where, and I've done this before, and I might have made the same mistake with Searle, but I jumped out at first and said, no, that can't possibly work. It's all bullshit. But the deeper I looked into that, the more we realized there might be something there. He's talking about those second covers that beetles have on their wings, and there's a question of how beetles can actually fly, and it's possible that it has something to do with electrostatic scalar fields.
Yeah, because you ever see a bee maneuver? These things be turning and zipping and stopping on a dime,
but a bee is a different thing altogether. A bee has its wings in free air, whereas imagine if you were to put a cover on those wings that's static. How in the world can a bee or a bug fly with a cover on top of them? Now, we understand why it has the cover. They theorize that it has something to do with the rain, not hurting the wings. But really, what is those covers there for? And how does the freaking beetle fly?
Well, the big bumblebees, the black bumblebees, they're supposed to be aerodynamically impossible flying, but they do it, and I see them zipping and stopping, and pretty much what I see these UAPs doing. They're making these weird maneuvers. So there's something in nature that we just didn't pick up on, or we picked up on it and then we forgot it somewhere in the dark ages. But I think that's why the Egyptians revered the beetle, because they knew something. Yeah.
Yes, and the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, were much closer to this technology. Back in the day, there was flying saucers over their heads all the time, and they just revered the occupants of the saucers as gods and gave them all these names and stuff, and worshipped them and whatnot. But if you look deeper into the mystery of the beetle and how it's able to fly, you can see some other cool effects that might be related, such as scalar fields. And I would like to break down what a scalar field is, for the audience. So basically, when you have normal electricity, you're dealing with a positive and a negative, and it's flowing from the negative to the positive. You have the flow of the electrons, and that is your electrical potential. You have the potential pressure of the electrons flowing. When you have a scalar field, all you have is just one pole. It's like a monopole electric field. It's just the positive, it's just the negative. And it's just negative in terms, in relation to everything around it, meaning it's going out in a 360 sphere in all directions. An example of that in nature is ball lightning. When you have a DC potential or a high voltage DC potential, that's different because the field is not it's not round. It's skewed to one side toward the other electrode, and that's no longer scalar. But when you have scalar fields, you're able to build up much higher potentials than you were ever able to build with just a regular electrostatic field. And we think that that's possibly what's going on with beetles, that they have this, when their wings are beating, they're creating negative on the bottom and positive on the top above that cover, and they're able to repel against Earth because Earth has a negative potential to it. Now, Grebennikov claimed to have built this device. For all intents and purposes, it does look like a scam. The pictures are kind of wanting. There hasn't been many people that have replicated the effect since then. So, my eyes are open to anyone who will be willing to try it. And I'd like to see where things go with that. Another device that I thought you were talking about earlier is the Alexei Chekarkov Gravity Flyer. This thing seems to be put together out of junk. It's this guy in Russia. He has a Tesla coil, high voltage power supply. He has a piezo electric. It's basically an ultrasound microphone on top, and he's fiddling around with it, and then suddenly it starts to fly. The power supply is on the ground, so it's not flying with the power on board. It gets up to about 30 feet in height. He circles around it. He puts sticks over it and below it just to show you that there's no strings. When I first saw that, I was like, this is definitely a hoax. It makes no sense. Can't figure out why in the world it would work. There's two discs that are spinning around with magnets on it. I have no fucking clue what's going on. So that remained the case until I got a friend of mine to translate the YouTube video for us. And this is me and the team. Jeremiah Pop was there, and Wayne Ojala, and many other YouTube researchers who've been dealing with this stuff. And word for word, she was explaining to us what he was saying. And we started to realize that there might be actually something there, because he was at the edge of science talking about concepts that we were only recently becoming aware of, such as rotating magnetic fields, how they differ and create different effects. He was also talking about rotating static fields, which we know produces some effect. He was also talking about that the center disk is being hit with RF, or radio frequency, in its resonant range, meaning that it would have been creating standing waves on the surface. He also shows this device that was used for checking for the standing waves, which basically looked like a voltmeter with two probes coming out, like a dipole antenna, and with each end connected to, one to the positive, one to the negative, and then there was another antenna that was connected to ground, I think, in the center. And when he said that when the device was properly tuned, he'd see a potential across those two, and the potential would be DC. It wouldn't be changing, and that's how you know that the device is in tune. When you see it in AC, then you know that it's out of tune, and slowly it goes down to 0 hertz, which is a DC potential. So we knew that he's dealing with standing waves. He's dealing with rotating magnetic fields, rotating static fields, and he also had an ultrasound transducer that was shaking the center disk at its resonant frequency. And after seeing all that, the interest in our group just kept on rising. There was a scientist or anti-gravity researcher here in the U.S. named Chris Hardiman, based out of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And this past January, he built a device, saw 80 grams of weight loss, and a week or two later, he died of a heart attack at work. So we contacted his widow, and I flew down to Oklahoma City and basically cleared out all of his work, brought it over here to the lab in New Jersey so we can continue his work. I'd also like to give a shout out to Flo Hardiman for donating everything to science. We're going to put it to good use, and if anything comes of that, we'll definitely mention his name in the credit. One thing that I thought was very interesting is that he was using this Tesla coil. And this is something that Alexei Chekhov was using as well. He was using a special type of Tesla coil that is self-tuning. And it's very difficult to tune that Tesla coil to be in resonance with the plate. And you'd have to have frequencies that are very, very high compared to what a Tesla coil can normally put out, in the order of like 200 to 600 megahertz, depending on the disk size. So that's one of the reasons why we're going toward an RF transmitter instead, basically a ham radio. You can create those same effects and have it work every time, because Alexei Chekhov would fiddle around with the device trying to tune it for hours before he would get liftoff. And we would want a device that you just flip a switch and it takes off. Those are all thrusting effects. If they do work, they'll be pulling or pushing against space-time or against standing magnetic fields if they do work. And you'd have a hard time actually building a device strong enough to take off on its own. Another thing is that, and this is something we do see with flying saucers, is that they can't be touching the ground when they're powering up, because if they're touching the ground, the resonance of the craft will change, and you have other effects. It'd be very difficult to get off those first 5 feet, which is why they kind of land on landing struts, or they try not to land at all. Also, the original craft from Germany that we saw, those were suspended in the air. Also, another thing we see with flying saucers is the glow that surrounds the craft. That only happens when they're at altitude. When they're less than 100 feet off the ground, they're just plain metallic, no glow. But as soon as they get up there a couple hundred feet, we start to see the glow. That would be explained by high voltage scalar fields. Yeah, the ionization is happening from the high voltage scalar fields, which again, scalar fields are voltage potential versus the outside, versus the 360 around the craft. So if you get to voltage potentials in the millions of volts, you can start seeing these ionizations. And the reason why there's no lightning between the craft and the ground is because as they're building up their potentials, they're flying farther away. If they came closer to the ground, there would be a slow breakdown, and the scalar potential would drop. But we do see some lightning strikes between craft and power lines, high voltage power lines that have been observed in the past. That fits in with that theory pretty well. There's a couple of people who are currently working on the Graviflyer device. One of them is in our group. His name is Tony Robertson. He worked for NASA. He was on the team with Ning Li when they tried to reproduce the Podkleonov spinning disk experiment, which is the other experiment that Eugene Podkleonov did. They never actually completed that experiment because they ran through their budget trying to get the superconducting disks built, which they successfully did after getting a 1,000-ton press in order to press it together. So that was a pretty difficult build. Later discovered that if the effect actually worked, which was supposedly a gravity shielding effect of some sort, it would have actually been more about the way that they spun the disk. So it wasn't using a motor to spin. They were using rotating magnetic fields. And we told you before, rotating magnetic fields can produce some sort of effect on all matter. It's sort of like a magnet for everything, even non-magnetic materials. It may be possible to amplify that effect and create some sort of something in space-time that you can latch onto. That's something we should definitely look into. Another team member, Charles Crawford, he's based out of Texas. He's in direct contact with Alexei Chekhov and has actually purchased some parts from him, and should be receiving them shortly. And there's also Russell Anderson, who's worked on the Searle effect generator, who we talked about that earlier, but he's working on the Graviflyer at the moment, in the hopes that if he gets it to work, he'll be able to sell it, sell kits or sell a working device and use that money toward building a Searle effect generator. So that there's quite a few teams that are working on it. We also have a guy named Alex Jones, not the Alex Jones. This is somebody of the same name who lives around the corner over here in New York, and he's interested in this effect as well. So there's quite a few people who are interested in that experiment, and
then what are they going to do with it?
Well, if it works, they'll show everyone the effect. We'll try to figure out what is actually making it tick, and is there a way to amplify the effect and make a full-size craft out of it.
Well, don't you think we've been building craft like this in secret for the last 50, 60 years?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, anything that I'm doing here in the lab, or that any of the people that we're working with are doing, could have been done 60 years ago. There's no reason why not. It's not like we're doing anything that advanced. It could have. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the equipment we're working with is about that old, so it might have even, some of the equipment might have even been used in the original experiments. So yeah, we are reinventing the wheel. Totally admit.
Yeah,
that. But
that wasn't meant as a put down
there.
Yeah, exactly. That's what my intent was not a
most important
put down, but it needs to because I think most people are comfortable with the idea that such propulsion systems exist. I mean, how many people haven't seen a flying saucer?
Guys, we're coming up on the top of the hour. I mean, the bottom of the hour. Excuse me. So we're going to take this break, and when we come back, are you up for taking callers if we get anybody? Mark?
Yeah, sure. I would love to hear some questions, and
okay.
Hopefully with somebody with some interesting knowledge. And
okay, so guys, when we come back, you can call the participation line, which is our call-in number is 917-889-8802. So you can call in and we'll take your call if you got any questions for our guest. But we will continue to talk about anti-gravity as soon as we come back from this break.
theothersideofmidnight.com. Tune in to listen to Richard C. Hoagland and his fascinating guests. Join Club 19.5 to get access to exclusive member benefits. Search the archives. Listen to past episodes anytime on any device. Membership costs $9.95 a month, 33 cents a day. Support the broadcast that provides you with the most interesting conversation available. Talk radio at the cutting edge of science and thought. TheOtherSideOfMidnight.com.
TheOtherSideOfMidnight.com. Talk radio with pictures on demand. Liberate your hyperdimensional time scale and non-linearly access over 400 hours of conversation at the cutting edge of science and thought. Join Club 19.5 to get access to exclusive content that fits your interests and time schedule. Filter episodes by guest or subject. Membership costs $9.95 a month, 33 cents a day. Listen while you travel or as an environment to your endeavors. 8 cents an episode, 2.5 cents per hour of content. TheOtherSideOfMidnight.com.
And welcome back to The Other Side of Midnight. I'm your host for tonight, Keith Morgan, usually doing the audio and the engineering. But tonight we've got Mark Sokol, and we've opened up our caller lines. So if you'd like to call in, if you've got a question, it's 917-889-8802, and we'll take your calls. Let's get back to Mark real quick. So, Mark, is this kind of tech really stimulating the blood? Is it getting you going? Because you know you're sitting there right on the edge of what's new. And there's more stuff out there that's just... There's so much tech that's coming out right now. We're in a new industrial revolution. No, change that. We're in a new technological revolution. And most people don't see it coming. They have no idea what's coming down the pike, and it's going to change everything. The way we use energy, the way we generate energy, and the way we get around. This could have been there a long time ago. Yeah.
It's mostly the way we get around that I hope to change. If let's say we get something that can get us into space on just a couple kilowatt hours of energy. And I'm talking like battery powered or hydrogen fuel cell powered. No, nothing too exotic, nothing too out there. Using off the shelf technologies, we just find a way to convert that electrical energy potential into either dynamic nuclear orientation or some sort of thrust to make the craft just take off and fly. One of the first things we'd want to do is clean up low Earth orbit from all the space junk. Another thing we'd want to do is mine the asteroid belt. There's asteroids out there that are near pure nickel or iron or even rare earth elements, and stop destroying our planet with all these open pit mines, and just pull them straight out of the asteroid belt and bring them down here to refineries, clean them up and turn them into more Tesla vehicles, more electric cars or something like that. That would be that would be useful use of this technology. Getting rid of airplanes, replacing those with flying saucer type devices, and getting rid of open pit mining operations. I'm sure with the advent of anti-gravity craft that are capable of interstellar missions, we'll probably come in contact with extraterrestrial races that have been trying to leave us alone for the most part because of the Prime Directive. They don't want to interfere with our development. But once we reach that point, we're open for contact. So there's a lot of changes that will be happening with this technology come to light.
Well,
Ooh.
I think in
I got
2022.
2 questions for you.
Oh, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I got two questions for you there. One, interesting that you don't believe in religion, but you do believe in the prime directive. Do you really think they would follow something like that, or is it just something that we made up based on our ethos?
Yeah, I do believe that they would follow something like that, and I wouldn't say that I don't believe in religion. I actually believe that the Torah, or the the 5 books of Moses and everything else, were written true to word of historical events that actually happened. I'm just reading them in a literal sense. And one thing that it doesn't say in the Torah ever is the word God. It talks about Jehovah and the Elohim, and how the sons of the Elohim had kids with the daughter of man, which basically puts them into flesh and blood bodies. So this Jehovah dude who's talking to Moses and who's giving us 10 commandments, he's flesh and blood too. And he's coming in on a spaceship from the heavens, which is also known as outer space. And,
and why does God need a spaceship? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you need to read the Lost Book of Enki. The Lost Book of Enki.
As a matter of fact, Keith, I was reading a new translation of it just last night, and there's some interpretations in there that very interestingly point to the fact that Enki and his friends were cannibals. We were a food source. There's indications in there of that, and that's what they were taking care of us for, to grow better cattle. And
no, we were supposed to mine the gold to help close the hole in their atmosphere. But there are, Ron, there are reliefs. There are reliefs in China on the wall showing some weird reptilian creature and another creature that looked like a hippopotamus head, but they had humanoid body forms, and they were humanoids sitting at tables, and the reptilian guy was stabbing a small human with a spear. Another one, he didn't look like a hippopotamus. He looked like something else. But he's rolling over one of them like he's tenderizing him with a big
the
wheel.
Egyptians had 2 major goddesses that looked like hippopotami.
Yeah, and then the hippopotamus
what's that got to do with anti-gravity?
He was throwing the guy into the pot. It's all ancient history that was technology that our ancestors, as primitive idiots, didn't understand. And now we're at a point where we can understand the technology, okay? So we can look at this differently. And all those writings in the Bible were written by people who were superstitious and God-fearing people, because they thought those people who had the technology were gods. We know better now. So we need to be growing up and looking at this differently.
Do we?
Yes. That's the only way we're going to grow.
For God, what if God just means a revered alien? I mean, Zeus, Poseidon, Jehovah, Allah, Krishna, even God of Mercury, he was a freaking messenger god. What if God just means a revered alien? Suddenly it all makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got no problem with that. Of course, it's perfectly reasonable to grant that some beings you run into might be in every way we could measure off the scale. They can't fight them, certainly can't beat them, and can't understand half of what they do. But by God, they seem to be useful sometimes. The ancient Egyptians actually hated their gods, and they weren't alone in that, but it was unusual. They were highly revered by the Sumerians for some reason. They had the opposite opinion. But yeah, they were interacting with somebody not from here. And I can be slightly affronted by the idea that they would come down and say, let's play gods. But, the situations are such that people would normally take to that. And it's depending on the divergence. There's more to that Arthur C. Clarke quote than just anything sufficiently advanced could be indistinguishable from magic. Point is, yes, of course. So it all looked like magic to the people that had no technology. And they tried to explain it, and we try to explain their explanations as if it makes any sense. And usually we can't. But the other question I had, though, was very simple. Mark, do you think that whoever visits us are all using the same technology?
No, there's got to be variations of that. Everybody's got to have a different variation. There's more than one way to do the same thing.
Well, no,
Yes,
but what is?
there's more than,
I want to fit it into Mark's thing.
I
Go ahead.
think there's more than one way of achieving these effects. I think fundamentally, there's probably just only a handful of basic concepts of what they're doing, like a flaw in Maxwell's equation or something that's missing over there that they're using in the electromagnetic field effects to create this linear propulsion. I think dynamic nuclear orientation is most likely the key effect that allows for interstellar travel. And even that, there's many ways to achieve it. Are you guys familiar with the ARV, the Alien Reproduction Vehicle that Mark McCandless talked about?
Sure.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Ben Rich said that there was a flaw in the mathematics, but we figured it out. And that's how they were able to create what he was talking about, being able to take ET home and all the other stuff. There was a flaw in the math. And,
he made that comment in a couple speeches. I don't recall that he published a book about it. So there's a lot of interpretation there. I'm not thinking that Ben Rich was giving away all the secrets. I think people were just saying,
well, he wasn't giving away secrets. He was just making these comments that were out there as far as anybody who really looked at this whole thing. He was trying to tell us on the sly, hey, we have this technology. He said these things are locked up in black projects so tight that it would take an act of God to get them released. And he's just telling us, hey, guys, pay attention. Just like when Eisenhower got out of office, he said, beware of the military-industrial complex. He didn't say, oh, don't look out for the military. He just said, beware of the military-industrial complex.
Because they're the ones that are facilitating this cover-up. It's not really government. But if you want to look deeper into that statement that there's a flaw in the mathematics and we figured it out, you should check out the presentation on APEC, or the Alternative Propulsion Engineering Conference, which is a Zoom-based conference that I helped found. It happens every 2 weeks. And there was a presentation from Richard Van Durek, which I recommend everyone watch. And in it, he gets into minute detail going over where the flaw in Maxwell's equation for electromagnetic energies, where the flaw was, and how to expand upon it, and make it into some useful linear effect.
Was this something that Arthur Heaviside did?
Heaviside had a simplification of
I thought
equations.
most of the flaws in Maxwell's equations came from Heaviside's redo.
That is true. That is true. The flaws came from Heaviside. Maxwell's equations accounted for a lot more effects that normally amount to zero in many cases. But when you get to the extremes, or when you get to resonances, then they start to show, and then you're able to latch onto those effects and amplify them in some way and create stronger effects. And that's something that if anyone's interested in the electromagnetic way of creating linear thrust should definitely look into. But getting back to the gods and the stories in the Bible, one of the interesting stories that we've seen during the Exodus was the Egyptians were chasing the Jews down to the beach, and this was all in Egypt or in the Sinai Desert. And Moses was there, and they had the Ananei Kavod, or those pillars of fire and smoke. There were 7 of them at the time. This is according to scripture. And one of them was behind them, and there was a couple on the side and one in front. And the Egyptians shot arrows at the Jews, and the arrows came flying back at the Egyptians. So the Egyptians obviously stopped shooting the arrows. This is something that we've seen during the Vietnam War as well. In 1973, there was a patrol boat in the DMZ, in the demilitarized zone, that had a flying saucer with 2 occupants clearly visible in a hatch above it. And they started shooting at it. It was like glowing red and whatever. And they started shooting at it with their guns. And there was a return fire. And it was like bullets were coming back at them. And then they shot a missile. The missile didn't come back at them, but the bullets were coming back at them. and they couldn't touch this craft. And soon they realized, after a couple of their men got killed, that the bullets they were shooting at it were coming right back at them. Then the next day, the craft appeared and shot that same missile that they fired at it at an Australian boat, and damaged it greatly and eventually sunk or something like that. But the most interesting thing is when we come up with the explanation at a 3M plant in 1995. 3M is the manufacturer of many tapes and plastic films and lots of shit. Almost everyone in America has something at home made out of 3M. Even Band-Aids.
C4
are made there.
Yeah, they make C4.
They make a ton of shit. So at one factory, they were unfurling this massive roll of plastic.
Language.
It was okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, this massive roll of plastic, really thin material, and it was going on a huge roller system up like 10 feet or 20 feet across, like a huge system in order to keep the tensions, the tensions correct. Now, in this factory, they've always had a problem with static electricity because these plastics are very strong dielectrics, and they're able to maintain a static field on their surfaces. On this particular day, there was something going on, and the static was just building up and building up and building up, and it got to a point where they tried measuring the field, and their meters were maxing out, and they tried walking in between where the sheets were unfurling, and they felt this sort of invisible wall, and they threw something at it, it would fly right back at them. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the.
What about cats? Were all the cats in the neighborhood stuck to it like flies?
Dude, what the cats in there? Okay.
I don't know where the cats came from, but anything that they flew at it, whether it was magnetic, whether it was conductive, plastic, any material that they threw at it, would come flying back at them with the same kinetic energy that they threw it in at. Which is pretty much what happened with the Egyptians, pretty much what happened at the demilitarized zone with that UFO craft. And it's what you'd expect of a spacecraft flying through space, that if there's microasteroids or something, micrometeorites, they would need some way of deflecting it. So this is probably the deflector field being turned on, which is using some sort of scalar energy, scalar potential. And that's able to just deflect everything out of the way. So here we have both a miracle happen in the Bible being replicated by accident in a 3M plant here in the United States. I think it was in Pennsylvania in 1995. And eventually they brought in some at first, the owner of the plant wasn't sure whether he should try to fix it or start selling tickets.
I probably know where it was. Could it have been DuPont instead of 3M?
No, it was definitely 3M. Definitely 3M.
Okay, well, then it was probably in Michigan. I don't know. That's where they are, but
they have
headquarters.
They have quite a few plants. But eventually they figured out to negate this effect by putting like grounding wires along the rollers and stuff like that. But it's pretty interesting that you were able to replicate these effects. They're not mysterious. They're just science that was misunderstood, and in many ways, it's been covered up until this time. And there's a reason why you're taught the simplification of Maxwell's equations in college, and you're not. They don't go into details like they normally do. Keith, is there any callers yet?
No callers. We're about 10 minutes out from the end of the show.
Blogspot's a little complicated that way sometimes. Yeah, you never know.
Yeah, but we were in second place on TalkStream Live and on Paranormal Radio, and we had about 105 listeners on our stream server. So we were doing pretty good tonight. If anybody wants to call in, if you're still listening, area code 917-889-8802. We still got 9 minutes before we hit the end of the show. So give us a call if you'd like to questions or comments.
Mark,
we're here.
Mark, there must have been a loose end somewhere.
There has to be. I think
No. I meant in what you've been covering, because you have been surprisingly agile and moved in many directions. So is there something that you need to put a cap on?
Yeah, just to tell people how to find me. If you're interested in this technology, if you want to help out in any way, we are looking for volunteers to help us out in the lab. We're located in Hawthorne, New Jersey. So I like to joke that we're the SpaceX of the East, because SpaceX is in Hawthorne, California. We're in Hawthorne, New Jersey. Our website is falconspace.org, which takes you straight to the YouTube channel where you can see basically our experiments. You could also check us out on Alien Scientist on YouTube. Many of the live streams there involve visits to the lab. Also, if you want to check out the Alternative Propulsion Engineering Conference to get an in-depth view of these experiments and different theories and ideas and things that people are working on, check out altpropulsion.com. That's ALT propulsion.com. There's also a YouTube channel for alternative propulsion, and there's also Tim Ventura, who moderates the show and hosts the show. He has his own channel called American Anti-Gravity, which is something that he's been working on for about 20 years now.
We have Robert Morningstar. Yep. He's one of the Enterprise mission guys. He's on the line. You guys like to... I'm bringing him on now. So,
Robert.
How you doing, Rob?
Hey, Robert.
Oh, fine, thank you. I'm just calling to say I've enjoyed the show immensely. And I've been thinking of a question. So here's the question for Mark. Mark, if I could provide you with all of the resources you need, including two 50-foot metallic discs that whose resonance you know, how would you build the craft, but what would be the power source to generate the millions of electron volts that you would need for this? What power source would you use?
Okay. I would probably go with a hydrogen fuel cell system with a hybrid battery. So it would be a hybrid electric, similar to the Toyota Mirai, which is an electric vehicle mostly driven in California. You might have seen them there. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, it's off-the-shelf technology. And also the side effect of it, the output is water. So if you get stuck anywhere, water is a good thing to have. Also, you can fill up the tanks pretty rapidly, and with a large craft, you can fit quite a few hydrogen tanks in the hold, and you'd also need oxygen tanks as well, and that would pretty much give you power source for many megawatt hours of power in a decent form factor.
You would need millions of electron volts. Wouldn't you need a long series of step-up transformers after you have the basic charge coming out of the hydrogen cells?
Well, it depends what you mean by millions of volts. Are we talking about scalar potential? You can probably do that off of a AA battery, because if you're slowly siphoning off the energy and building up these static potentials, a AA battery can charge a Van de Graaff up to 500,000 volts, or it depends on the size of the Van de Graaff. But voltage without current is not very difficult to make. Especially when it's scalar and when the craft is way out.
What is the output of the current most efficient hydrogen cell that we have today? What is the highest output of the best hydrogen we have currently?
I think they use it on the space shuttle. I think off-the-shelf units can do like 30 or 40 kilowatts. Continuous, or no, probably even more than that. Now, if it's in a car, it's probably
continuous. That seems like a lot.
I
thought I thought it was a lot less than that, and they had to use multiple batteries. I understand Robert's question.
Would this craft rotate?
There's no limit. There's many reasons why it would rotate, depending on what your propulsion system is. Like the ARV device, or the alien reproduction device that Mark McCallish talked about, it had a spinning disk in it with a pulsing electromagnet around it to create the dynamic nuclear orientation.
Actually, those were spinning cylinders, more like the Searle device. A lot of people have looked at, I knew Mark very well, and I know his sketch. A lot of people have had trouble finding the disc because it's not a disc. He's got spinning cylinders like the Searle devices, like long bearings rather than ball bearings. But that's the question I had is, would it spin and of necessity, or could it be unspinning and still fly?
It depends on it depends on whether there's something spinning inside of it, and there's just lots of effects that you can get from spinning. It's literally the only thing you can do is spin things around. So you can either do it with microwaves.
Cause precession effects. What would that do to its maneuverability? Its tendency to turn 90 degrees opposite direction where you apply the force. And how would you apply the force? Would that be the external power devices you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, that would be either the gyroscopes. You'd be using either electrostatics. You won't be able to use a rocket, because if you are making the craft weightless, then the rocket output would also be weightless. So there wouldn't be an equal and opposite reaction. It would also screw with the field a bit.
What?
But, Yep.
So let me share something with you. It just came to my mind. I know a really, really great, let's call him a technician. He's a master of all trades. His name is Lance. And many, many years ago, he had an ET encounter. And they were instructing him on the steering device. And what they showed him was 3 gyroscopes that were mounted in a particular way, like an XYZ, and by varying the rotation on the gyroscopes, they claimed that that's how they were able to maneuver the craft. So since you've shared so much tonight, I thought I'd throw that one to you.
Thanks for calling, Rob. Well, we're coming up to the end of the show, so...
Okay, so I'll bail out, but thank you very much. It was a very enjoyable show.
Okay.
And give my best to Tim Ventura as well. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we're coming up to the end of the show right now, and this has been exciting. I love talking about this kind of technology because this is what's going to change the world. Most people don't see it coming, but I see a freight train coming down the track. All right, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just once again to plug my website, falconspace.org. That again will take you directly to our YouTube channel where you can just watch experiments. Also, allpropulsion.com. That would take you to the APEC website, and you'll be able to sign up for the upcoming conferences and learn more about anti-gravity and all different forms and different theories and stuff. If you want to get a hold of us, falconspaceprogram@gmail.com to connect, and we'll be able to bring you into the lab and try to get you to help out.
Falcon Space Mail.
Okay, guys, we're out of runway, and I've added a minute to the end of the show here. So, thank you for being our guest, Mark. Stick around for our after party. We'll see you on the other side. You've been listening to The Other Side of Midnight. I was your host, Keith Morgan. Our guest was Mark Sokol. See you next week.